I mean, we're making 2,000 horsepower with one-stage turbo now. I don't see why you couldn't put compounds on it, raise the inlet pressure on the turbo by a half an atmosphere and make 3,000 horsepower. I mean, just by math, it ought to work. So, but, listen, we'd been drinking beers too, so it seemed like it made a lot more sense then too. But the bottom line is he said, okay, let's try it.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Shane T. Now, Shane is probably no stranger if you have spent any time in the world of EFI tuning. He's probably one of the most prominent names, and he's spread his skills around just about every facet of motorsport, from drag racing, where he's been involved in several world record holding teams, through to Pikes Peak, which we discuss in today's podcast, and circuit racing, and of course just simple street cars. Oh, and let's not forget land speed record racing. So there's not really a lot that Shane hasn't done or seen in the world of EFI tuning, and I rate him as one of the smartest guys that I personally know. In this episode, we catch up on what's been going on since we first talked to him. In particular, we dive into the compound triple turbo setup SR20 drag engine, where he was shooting for an incredible 3,000 horsepower from a 4-cylinder engine. We'll find out how that's all going and whereabouts he is in terms of that aim. We talk about his recent success at Pikes Peak with the LMP3 Pikes Peak hill climb car, not a combination you'd probably normally put together. And we also dive into traction control and launch control strategies and how best to implement these. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome back to the podcast, Shane. Thanks for coming back and having a chat. I'm not going to go over your background entirely, and if people do want to check you out and find out about the backstory, then I'd urge them to go and listen to episode 1, and then they can learn all there is to learn. But maybe if you could give us the 2 or 3 minute overview of who Shane T is. I don't know if you can fit it into 2 or 3 minutes, but have a crack.
Yeah, I'll have a go. Well, first, thanks for having me back on, and I feel honored to be back again, the first and second time guest. Let's see. Well, the short story is that I always had something to do with cars because I had an auto shop teacher for a dad. I started working on street cars after high school. I eventually went to work for his company doing diagnostics over the telephone, basically a call center for regular streetcar repair stuff. So I've got a lot of inside knowledge into electronics, fuel injection, how streetcars work. When I was a kid, I built a little weird random go-kart with a supercharger on it, and then played with it with a friend of the family that was a electronics engineer, basically. And we built a small ECU to control that engine. That gave me a keen insight into EFI at a young age. And then when I got tired of working for on regular streetcars, I started working at Motec in 2001 in the US. as their engine calibrator, if you want. They weren't called that, they were just a tuner. And I did that in that capacity until I left in 2006 to basically do the same thing for myself. And I have been doing ever since.
Right. Okay. I think you did a great job of packing that into a short amount of time. Good job. Now, I mean, why we love talking to you is because you do have a reputation for getting results and setting world records, and because of that, you get to work on some incredibly interesting cars and some incredibly interesting engines. Last time we spoke to you, and I want to kind of recap both of these, we talked a little bit about an LMP3 car converted to Pikes Peak spec, and you are freshly off the back of Pikes Peak. We also talked about a compound turbo SR20 VE based drag engine where you were shooting for a ridiculous, unbelievable 3,000 horsepower. So we want to catch up on both of those. But given that literally Pikes Peak happened a couple of days ago, yeah, I think I saw on your Instagram the car went under 10 minutes. So everything must have worked pretty well.
Yeah, it went swimmingly. So the long and the short story of this project is that, well, first of all, when I worked at Motec, because I was the main tuner, I couldn't focus on a specific genre. I had to work on whatever anybody called. They bought a Motec and they needed tuning. I went and did it anywhere in the U.S. So because of that, I got exposed to a lot of different types of engines and racing genres, if you want. And so I enjoyed all of them. I learned a lot because I got to do a lot of it in a lot of different venues. Pikes Peak's one thing I never really got my finger in the middle of. And I always wanted to do it. And I had plenty of people calling me over the years that, wanted me to come and tune for Pikes Peak, but they always wanted me to, they would call, like race week or the week before race week. And they'd be like, can you show up? And that what they wanted was the magic wand. And they thought that somehow I was going to show up and, they were going to win. And that's just not how it works there. And I never really wanted to go if I didn't have a shot at winning because I hadn't been. And by then I was reasonably successful in most of the other things that I had been involved with because I've been involved with good teams with good parts and, people that'll kind of let you do what you want or what you know how to do. And so, the opportunity never presented itself. And so I had one of those teams that I had worked with doing a little SCCA runoff car, a D Sports racer with Level 5 Motorsports and in association with Kelly Moss. And Kelly Moss had a customer and I had worked with them since, in 2012, we did the D Sports racer thing and that was fantastic, hugely successful. And we did projects together, from time to time. But anyway, they called me and I think it was 18 and said, hey, we have a customer that wants to run Pikes Peak and do you want to be involved? Well, it was January. So Pikes Peak is in June, the race. You start practicing about 4 weeks before that. So that's May. And, unless you have a car that you've been working on for a while, starting to try and build an entire Pikes Peak race vehicle in the end of January, you just don't have time to do it and actually think you're going to have any level of success.
Always wishful thinking.
Yeah, it's wishful thinking. And I know you need to start this about a year ahead, plan for it, pick the right parts. Otherwise you're just doing the same thing. Like, hey, we have all this stuff. Let's try and figure out how to make it work. And
There's nothing worse than trying to rush a project and then you're trying to finish building the car in the car park at Pikes Peak at 5 a.m. before your practice day starts. And it's just never a recipe for a successful result, no matter what discipline in motorsport you're doing. But I also understand it because we've been guilty of doing exactly that ourselves.
The problem now, I'm 50, so I've been there and done that enough times. I know how it most likely is going to go. And so I'm just not up for that because I just know you put in the same effort and you get no result.
I think the other thing that that sort of comes out of that is, rightly or wrongly, the tuner is kind of always the last person to touch the vehicle before it leaves the start line. Hence, when it doesn't go well, for a million factors that are out of your control, the finger always gets pointed. And someone like yourself, you have to protect that reputation.
There's an element of that too. But again, if you do this long enough, then eventually it's so difficult to be successful. And it takes a different mindset. And particularly if you're going to try and do it over and over again. Yeah, you can luck into stuff. But if you want to do it on any consistent basis, you realize like, man, you really have to, just like a race car is like every race car, try and minimize the risk of failure points before you ever show up to the racetrack with it. The stuff that isn't going to work, just fix it. You don't even waste time waiting for it to be a problem if you know it's going to be a problem.
Yeah. I guess the other part of that, just to sort of expand on it though, is the stuff that you don't even know that you don't know. And I mean, I think to a degree, if someone's never been involved in Pikes Peak before, you can have the best laid plans, have a really good strategy, the best of the parts, the best people involved, and then if you've never run a car up Pikes Peak before, you kind of quickly find out that there's some problems that you couldn't have even anticipated. Is that fair to say?
I don't. That's entirely fair to say, and I don't have any problem with that. Problems that you experience because you don't know about them, I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is going there already having problems that you know you have, and assuming that somehow you're going to work it out, or magically they're just going to go away. I have no trouble with having to learn, but let's not show up at the racetrack with any known problems. Let's learn new problems.
Yep, that's totally reasonable. I mean, by definition, you can't fix a problem that you're not even aware about. But if you do have known problems, then there's absolutely no reason to be going racing.
Yeah, yeah. So anyhow, so back to the story. So these guys, say, look, when we go to Pikes Peak, and I'm like, no, let's get the thing ready, and we'll go next year when we can be prepared. Well, we can't go next year. Like, well, why? Because the guy's dying of cancer and he's not going to be around next year. And this is his dying wish, is to race Pikes Peak. So are you in or are you out? Like, yeah, of course I'm in. So they had bought a GT3 Cup car, and it was like, look, we'll get some turbos that seem like they're right to try and keep the thing making the 500 or 600, whatever it makes at the wheel, normally aspirated. We'll just try and hold that power level. We don't have time to do a whole lot of R&D. So we'll try and get the right turbos on it, put an intercooler on it, run some high octane gas, one C16 or something, and we'll just see how we get on. So that's what we did. And unfortunately, we crashed out when it came to race week. Like, first day of practice up the top, spun the thing into the rocks and about knocked the back of the car off, and it was unfixable. And so then everybody was obviously super bummed for him because of the situation. But the great part is that he managed to get ahead of the cancer, and he's been in remission, or at least managing it now for the greater part of 5 years. So we went back the next year with an even better mousetrap. And, like, to your point about, thinking you have it figured out, and then you go to Pikes Peak and you learn that you really don't. But there was an element of that with that first car. The second year we knew what to expect a little bit more anyway. And we came back with a weapon. And unfortunately, he crashed that out in qualifying, end over end off the side. He was fine, but it destroyed the car.
It's not a very forgiving racetrack.
It's not forgiving. And, at that point, the emotions are pretty low, because it's like, so the opportunity for the LMP3 car came along in between those two seasons. And so, knock on wood, since we've had the LMP3, we haven't had those sorts of problems. But, it was a whole different car that we had to basically start from scratch. And some of the stuff we had learned from the Porsche worked, but some of it didn't, because these cars were designed for two completely different things. So the short story is that the success that we had this year, and we had success in every possible way. I mean, we broke nothing. I have not ever been at an event where I did less with the laptop than this event, but that's taken 5 years, and in 3 years with the same exact setup, and refining it and going back every year. Even last year, we summited, I think, 4 years ago, but we didn't. We summited 3 years ago. 4 years ago was the first time we made it to the top of the LMP3, but we didn't really make it to the top because there was snow and ice. So they only ran a 2/3 course, but we at least didn't crash. So that was a win. And then we went back the next year and we got red flagged, and there was fog on our second run up. And he just had to basically go 5 miles an hour because he couldn't see anything. And we had a 12-minute time. Last year, we went back. The whole goal was to try and be under 10 minutes. We finished 10 minutes, 0.3, right? 0.3
Devastating.
Off of, 3 and some change off of a 9-minute time. So that was the big goal for this year, is like, let's try to go under 10. But in all those years, we were fixing things, the cooling system, oil pressure, whatever, all the things that we addressed over those 4 years now. This is the fourth year with that car, all played into the success of this week. We had not one problem with anything, nothing. He never had a problem driving it. We didn't have anything to fix. We bring the thing down, put it on the setup pad, check it again, because we have a lot of time and it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong. And we double, triple check everything, make sure no bolts are falling off, look for lines that are loose, and just, there's nothing. I mean, there wasn't anything. And, ask him, hey, what can we make better? I made one traction control adjustment on the first day. And after that, we never changed it. Now, we got some in qualifying. We did really well, reasonably well. we were 4 minutes 12 in qualifying. Last year we were 4 minutes 10. I think our best ever was 4 minutes 8 on the year when we got fog. But that's okay. We just wanted to get, the thing was the weather was coming in, which is part of the fun of being at Pikes Peak. So the weather was coming. And so we thought, let's just get one on the board, because if we don't get another shot, anything is better than nothing. If you have nothing, you go to the back of the pack.
I remember the first time I went to Pikes Peak, and we go through the practice week, and then you qualify on that bottom section of the mountain from memory. So bottom section, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'm sort of thinking to myself, what's the deal with this? Why are we qualifying? It's a timed run up the mountain solo. We're not racing in a pack. What does it matter? And then there was my lack of experience with Pikes Peak, because almost like clockwork, around about midday, the weather comes in and you'll get snow and ice and hailstones the size of tennis balls, and that's it. So if you don't qualify and get your run in near the start of the day, your chances of actually completing a race run to the top dwindle quite dramatically.
What everybody thinks they know about Pikes Peak is about 10% of what Pikes Peak actually is if you go to actually compete. Because race day is all you know about. You show up and you go up the mountain. Yeah, that's true. But leading up to race day, firstly, it is the most ridiculous schedule. They let you up. The thing is that the road is a public road, and they can't afford to leave the road closed all day for people to test their race cars. So what they do is they give them, I think, 2 hours or 3. They give us 3 hours. So we have to be off the mountain by 9 a.m. And we can start running as soon as we're comfortable with the amount of light we have, which makes it about 6-ish, maybe 6:30, something like that. So you get about 2 hours a day. They do have some test sessions that happen a few weeks before the actual race week, but it's the same exact deal. You get up at 2:30 in the morning, you go get the car and the truck and the trailer, you go sit and you wait at the bottom of the entry gate to Pikes Peak, and then you drive up either to the top section, the middle section, or the bottom, because they divide all of the competitors into 3 groups so that nobody is running with a massive group, and everybody gets to run 1/3 of the course. But the problem with that is you never get to run the whole course until race day. Okay. The top of the mountain starts at about 12,500 feet at Devil's Playground, runs up to the summit at 14,115. That section of the course is above timberline. It's also cold enough that it generally has permafrost on it. And so the ground is very unstable, and it literally changes throughout the day's weather conditions. With the sun on it, it's hot. Since they pave the upper section, the asphalt tends to sink into the permafrost. The heave changes. So that the course from that section up is almost a living, breathing thing, right? That changes depending on all kinds of different factors. Then keeping in mind that it's a public road that's not meant as a racetrack. There's no guardrails. You can go off anywhere you want, into the woods, off the side of the mountain, wherever. And it's a public road. So, it's got bumps in it. It's got cracks in it. It's got dirt clods on it. It can have dirt on it, rain, water, anything, because it's a public road that goes up a mountain. So that course is never, it's never the same any 2 times you go up it. And you never get to run the whole thing from one end to the other until race day. And then add in all these other factors, let alone the fact that you start at 9,300 feet where the air density is, 72% of what it is at sea level. And you finish at 14,115 where the air density is 62% of sea level. So you have that whole thing to contend with as a tuner. There's no real place you can go run the engine on the dyno at that. You're not even at the starting line. So your best case scenario, you're running on the dyno at Pikes in Colorado Springs. It's about 6,300 feet. So
it's all stacked against you.
Everything's stacked against you. So
just on the note of that road, I remember distinctly standing at the top, that top section, and seeing how bad the road was. And I can't remember, I talked to one of the competitors who had been going there forever, because of course initially Pikes Peak was famous because it wasn't sealed. And then they sealed it, and basically the story I got told is that, at the altitude they're at, really asphalt doesn't work, and what you get is the snow melt basically gets underneath the road, and then overnight it freezes, so then it lifts the road. And I saw on Rob Dahl's story just a couple of days ago, his RX-7 literally getting airborne over bumps on that top section of the road. We've talked to other people about how hard that is to deal with. Now, I also remember I think he's still got the internal combustion engine world record, Sebastian Loeb, in that Peugeot
Audi
whatever.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's an epic little car. But again, from what I've been told, I mean, these are all third-hand stories, so I imagine there's some truth in it. He ran that car and got that record, like literally the year they'd actually resealed that top section of the mountain, so it was like billiard ball table smooth. And now it's not that. So there's some challenges outside of just setting the car up and being able to drive the car really quickly. And I mean, obviously the condition of the road is something it's out of your control. Maybe at some point they're going to reseal it and you'll have 1 to 2 years to set a cracking record before it turns to shit again, and then we're dealing with cars getting airborne. On that note, I can't imagine an LMP3 car, which is obviously designed for circuit racing, would be the ideal car to base a hill climb car on, particularly with these bumps I've just mentioned, given that they run so low and obviously the aero downforce is so critical with them. Looking back, is it a good base for a Pikes Peak hill climb car?
No, it's got its own challenges. The first thing was that it doesn't have a tight enough turning radius, or it was never intended to have a tight enough turning radius to make some of the tight corners at the top of the mountain or in the W section. So they had to change the steering geometry, and then it ran into the body. So they had to cut holes in the body so the tires wouldn't rub. The first thing you have to do is take everything good about the LMP3 and screw it up by raising the ride height enough that it can clear all the heaves and bumps. And even when you turn, it's a mountain road and it's a significant incline. So when you turn into a corner, I mean, it's a huge transition from the in part of the corner to the out part of the corner in elevation. And I mean, even that can make it scrape the right front and the left rear, or, depending on which direction the car's turning. The car's probably too long wheelbase wise to be a really good car for up there. Certainly it's too heavy. The thing weighs 2675 with a driver in it. As it came from the LMP3 Le Mans series, road racing series, it didn't have anywhere near enough downforce for up there, because keeping in mind that you lose the air density and the engine makes less power, but also the wings become less efficient. So no, it's not. If you are designing a car for Pikes Peak, that is not what you would choose. But the price was right. And I don't know, somehow they had a line on it and they got a hold of it. And so that's what we used. I mean, the other thing is that thing, the engine was homologated without turbos. So, you're taking a carbon, you got a limited space and it's all carbon. And it was engineered to the point where it was meant to run with the power level that it had, and mostly at sea level and around relatively fast road courses. And so the airflow to the radiators, obviously it never had an intercooler in it, oil coolers, things like that. All these things you have to stick on it just to be able to go run Pikes Peak, because it was engineered for the right size radiator to make whatever the power level was that the normally aspirated engine made. And that was running at normal sea level kind of ish altitudes. And
I think that actually was the biggest wake-up call for me. Everyone who hears about Pikes Peak understands the air density is low, and hence the challenge is making power. Obviously, a turbocharged engine, we have a few more levers that we can pull compared to a naturally aspirated, but still it's a challenge. What I had completely failed to even consider was that low air density also affects the ability of the radiator and the intercooler to actually reject heat. And we had significant problems with overheating on a car that had absolutely no issue at sea level, despite the fact that sea level is probably making 200 horsepower more as well. These are the things, again, you don't know what you don't know, but you quickly learn. And you're then at Pikes Peak, you don't have the benefit of being able to go and source a larger radiator, redo all of the bodywork to fit that in. So what do? Well, you jerry rig a water sprayer onto the radiator, and then you do some trickery in the ECU to try and reduce the engine temperature as it gets hotter, and then you literally cross your fingers and hope it makes it to the top.
Yeah, it leaves the starting line, and it's like no other kind of racing in the world, because you don't see the car until it comes back down several hours later. So once it makes that corner, it's out of your hands, unless of course they send you back 2 or 3 times to refill it with fuel and try again, like they did with us this year.
So talk about that, because that's I don't think I've seen that happen in the 2 times I went there, but maybe it just didn't happen to our car, so out of sight, out of mind. Because obviously they don't wait for the car ahead of you to reach the finish line, otherwise you'd be there for a week. So they're sent at intervals, correct?
Yeah, they send them every couple, maybe 3 minutes, and they may do some spacing depending on who they're sending next and who's in front of them. One speed versus the other, but the bottom line is that they send one, let's just say every 3 minutes. And because keeping in mind that this is literally a road up a mountain. So you get to the finish and you just basically have to stay there until everyone else is done coming up. You can't go back down, obviously, if they're coming up. And if they were sending them up and down, they would be waiting all day for that to take place. So you run up and you wait until the last guy has finished. And then they take a parade back down at the end of the day. So the caveat to that is if something happens and they red flag you. So that happened to us this time. It happened twice before we actually made it all the way to the summit. We left the starting line and the competitor ahead of us, he had a moment or whatever and knocked some debris, rocks or dirt or whatever onto the racetrack. And so they red flagged us when we were about not quite 3/4 of the way up. So they red flag you, you have to stop. They turn you around. They do not send the next competitor, or they red flag him also. And both of you return to the starting line. You then have 20 minutes during which you can refuel the engine, refuel the car, and set tire pressures only. You cannot connect a laptop. You can't use a wrench in theory. You can't do other things. And then you're going to go run again. So we came down. We elected to simply, like he said, everything's good. It's not hot. Nothing's wrong with it. It's great. Perfect. Turn it around right here behind the starting line. We'll go behind this next car. So we did. We turned it around, quickly decided how much fuel to put in it based on how far he'd run, and went back to the starting line, and he took off again. And this time the car in front of him failed to turbo and caught the car on fire. And so they had to deploy the 2 fire extinguishers, and they red flagged him again because that car was stuck on the side of the course on fire. So they sent him back to the starting line again. So I got the call over the radio, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. We're coming back again. Okay. So we go run, get more fuel jugs. And this time we're like, well, look, once again, if nothing's wrong with it, I mean, just turn the thing around and let's go. And let's do it before someone else gets in front of us. Because both times we've now had to stop because the guy in front of us did something, that caused us to have a red flag issue. So let's try it again. And Don was, he was getting tired.
Understandable. That's a lot.
Yeah. He's done like 2 years worth of races already. And so, yeah, we turned it around and set him up, and then we didn't have any problems. And we made it to the summit, and we summited in under 10 minutes, which, was basically a goal from the very beginning. And that's kind of the benchmark at Pikes Peak is to summit in less than 10 minutes.
So where does that leave you now? Accomplishment unlocked. Do you go back, or is that now that chapter's finished, the goal has been completed?
We have to have that discussion, and we will do later this week. But my suspicion would be, and my recommendation would be, so let me just back up. We ended up qualified 11th. It did take us 2 times or 3 times, I guess, to summit, but we had 0 problems with the race car. Driver did a great job. In fact, he got quicker in the lowest 2 sectors where we actually got a time. He was quicker the second time, and he was quicker again the third time. He was 2 seconds quicker the third time than he was the first time, so that was good. We actually lost out on practice earlier in the week because of rain and snow in our section of the racetrack that we were supposed to practice on that day. And so we sort of ended up getting our practice back. It just happened during the race. But yeah, so look, the whole goal, and in reality, we finished 5th overall, right? We finished 2nd in our class in Unlimited. We ran up there in less than 10 minutes, 9 minutes 40.5. There's not a whole lot more we can actually accomplish. And Pikes Peak is a risk reward type of racing environment. So going back next year, what's the next big goal? Well, I guess the next big goal would be either win overall or win class. But in reality, we were beat by Christian Merli, who is a multi-time European hill climb champion, in a car which is a far better car for that race than our car is, with factory backing from Oribe, who was there with all of their engineers, and a team built a car specifically to come race up there, and they took first, I think 9 minutes 4 seconds. There isn't scope in the car we have, or in power generation, or frankly in driver skill level to find 30 seconds to outrun someone like that. The bottom line is, if we went back, for us to finish in first place, everyone in front of us has to either not show up, or they have to screw something up. So again, we have to have that discussion, and I'm not sure what Don's thought process is on it, but I absolutely will recommend to him, the story probably doesn't get much better than this. So if you want to go back because you enjoy it, then let's do it. But I don't know what else we could actually tick off as an accomplishment.
Yeah, sometimes it's enough just to have achieved that goal and know that you've done it. The satisfaction's there. I mean, probably people listening will think, well, it's 30 seconds, turn the boost up. but it's just not that simple, particularly at Pikes Peak with the barometric air pressure. And you're absolutely right. I mean, driver skill has a lot to do with this, and maybe put that other driver you mentioned in that car, maybe it'll go a bit quicker. But, that's to the individual. As long as he's enjoying himself and he's achieved his goal, then I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that either. On that note, though, so give us your sort of perfect combination, given how well you know that mountain now, how well or poorly suited the LMP3 chassis is to Pikes Peak. If you had to pick a combination of chassis and engine, what would that look like? And I'm talking here to let's win this thing outright and let's keep it ICE for the moment.
Yeah, we had literally this exact discussion over the few hours of race day where all the crew is sitting in the pits talking. And so, look, just like every other type of racing, you want something that's light, something that's nimble, and you need some power generating unit that can generate the power you need for the weight you have, but also make enough in the lower end of the RPM band that you're not struggling waiting for, the turbo to come in or whatever. And so it's really hard to find something that can actually hit all of those targets. I'm thinking with the engine, the options are like, on one hand, you could do a compound turbo something, but that's really a lot of shit to manage and it's inherently heavy. You could try to do some fresh air antilag with some type of engine. That might work. You could use nitrous oxide, or you could try and use nitromethane and methanol. And what it would come down to is understanding the amount of power you require over and above what you can make with the turbo, particularly at the top of the mountain where the turbo effectively gets bigger than the engine, and fill in those holes that the turbo can't provide power, that you need power to be able to accelerate the car. Electric motors were discussed, but all of us being engine guys, we want to try and steer clear of that. So we're trying to think of every other possibility. And honestly, electric motors aren't light, and neither are batteries to run them. So
no. And then there's the complexity as well if you're going to have some sort of hybrid setup. I used to it'd be achievable, but is that the best hammer to hit the nail with?
I suspect that probably the best way, we were talking about this. So so as far as something you could put your hands on now, the Wolf chassis has proven itself to be a good choice. Maybe not the best choice, but it's definitely a good one if you're going to just pick.
For those who aren't sort of following this intently, Robin Shute, who's I think 4-time winner up there, has been running the Wolf chassis with a turbocharged Honda K20, and we've had him on the podcast as well. We'll put a link to that particular episode if people want to find out more. Also, the Juno, which Romain Dumas ran maybe the first year I was there, very similar in concept to the Wolf anyway. They're kind of a bit of a coin toss. And then, as I understand it, that Juno that he initially ran was actually converted into the Volkswagen IDR, which now holds the outright record. Can't remember who told me that. I trust them, so I think that's correct, but fact check that, I think. Yeah,
we'll go with it. I don't care. But the key element of that, which you just mentioned, was both Robin Shute and Romain Dumas, who can take any car and put it up near the top. So that becomes the extra part of it, right? So you can do everything you want with the car. The car has to be good, but in the end, you're going to need a driver that can run it at 10 tenths to be able to compete with other people who are willing to run 10 tenths. And so that's what it's going to take. There was one of the other cars there was another Wolf up there that had a V8 Hayabusa radical engine in it, twin turbo. And I thought, man, that's not a bad idea. And as we were kind of thinking through this, that thing didn't finish because it didn't have enough cooling system. So it overheated before it made it to the top. And so that goes back to your whole thing about Pikes Peak, where you don't know what you don't know until you go up there. And, you learn that even though you can, and here's the other thing, because you can't ever try it full length course, right? So you could run it at the top, like, nope, doesn't get hot. It's good. But that's only because you didn't start at the bottom.
Yeah. There's a whole difference between a 4-minute, run on one section of the mountain and, a 9-minute or whatever it might be for the full length. That's chalk and cheese.
Yep. Yeah. Chalk and cheese.
And again, I think you mentioned earlier, you can't test these things at sea level or even in Colorado Springs. The altitude is just not where it needs to be to get realistic data.
You do everything you're going to do, everything you can do that you can think of, and in the end, you got to go up there and take a little bit of a gamble.
The other thing I found quite quickly, which was an eye-opener for me, was how much boost response you lose at altitude. The engine that I was involved with was a Nissan GTR VR38. It was nothing particularly special, ran a pair of Garrett turbochargers, and I think at sea level was making about 800 wheel horsepower. And it had really good response. I mean, we had full boost by, I don't know, maybe call it 3,800 RPM, and we revved it to 8, so happy days. Get there, and straight away I'm looking through the data, and I'm like, a boost hose has got to have fallen off. Maybe one of the blow-off valves is leaking. And this thing was like lazy. It wasn't getting to full boost until closer to sort of 5. And I'm like, what's going on here? But again, just you don't know what you don't know. We went back just to your point about filling in the holes, because you can't go to a smaller turbocharger to gain back that response, because then you run out of turbocharger at the start line and you're screwed. So, I mean, it is a balancing act. I mean, we filled that in with nitrous, which is something I was always wanting to try as well. It always made perfect sense to me, and we'd done it with a couple of the drift cars, just for anti-lag. We weren't running it the whole time. And you wouldn't for a sub 10 minute run up the hill. You'd be out of bottle by halfway up, or not even that.
Yeah, you'd have to tow a trailer with enough nitrous. And here's the thing: like the turbo response is pretty good at the starting line. I mean, it's not as good as sea level, but it's good enough that it's not a problem. Where it's a problem is up top. So what you do is you would just spray it a little bit, and it doesn't take a lot, because all you're trying to do is make enough torque to get the thing to go up to your wheel slip number or close, right? So it just needs maybe it needs 25 or 30 horsepower, and it only needs that in a few turns when the throttle's wide open for maybe 1 second or 2 seconds. So then it comes down to what's the lightest or what's the least amount of mass I can carry up that hill to give me that power boost. Is it going to be a small load of nitromethane mixed with ethanol or methanol? Is it going to be nitrous oxide? I suspect that nitrous oxide is probably going to be the winner. You take a 20-pound bottle and maybe, let's say, so there's 30 pounds there. And I'm sure a single bottle, if used correctly, could easily be used to get the boost back that you need, so that you can size the turbo appropriately to make the peak power that you want and still get the response you need to be fast up top.
It worked like a charm for us. I had it enabled, so I can't remember the specifics too long ago, but when the driver went past, let's say, 80% throttle, below 5,000 RPM, but above 3,000, it would enable the nitrous. It was, I think, an 80 shot. It wasn't big. And then we'd shut it off once the turbo reached, say, 15 PSI, because you only need enough to sort of start generating exhaust gas energy to spool the turbo, and then it kind of becomes sort of self-fulfilling.
It'll hold itself, yeah.
Yeah, so it would probably switch on for, a second or so, like you say. Really helpful through that W section in the middle, where we've got all of those low-speed switchbacks where you're just too low in the RPM range. So I found that worked really, really nicely, and it was quite satisfying. A funny little anecdote with that, we wanted to test this system before we headed to Pikes Peak, and you don't really have a lot of opportunity to do so. We had a local hill climb up one of the ski field access roads here called Coronet Peak. They run this every year. I think it's been running for like 50 years now. And we turned up, and I'm just the tuner for this thing. I don't really have any involvement with the team, and I figured, because in New Zealand for hill climbs, nitrous is illegal. And I knew that. I thought they knew that. I mean, Pikes Peak's unique in that the rule book pretty much states you've got to have wheels, and anything else is up to you. So anyway, I kind of figured the team had sort of got this past the car club running the hill climb, and I guessed, hey, we're going to be exhibition only because, we don't meet the rules. I didn't care if they didn't even time us. I just wanted some data points before we put the thing in a container and shipped it to the other side of the world. They had not done that. So we get there, go through scrutineering, and they've got this big blue bottle of nitrous in the back, and everyone's like, what's that? You can't do that. I literally turned up there not knowing that this all got gone down, and got accosted by one of the competitors telling us that we were cheating and were ruining it, and what do we think was going on. So, okay, just chill out, we'll take the nitrous bottle out, no problem. So we did that, and we've got a professional driver in the car to shake it down, and of course, even without nitrous, it destroys the record up there that stood for 20 years. And old mate who sort of had me up at the start comes in again, accuses us of cheating, and this became a whole thing. I'm like, it's a $500,000 race car driven by a professional driver, and you're surprised that it beat your Evo 5 with an exhaust and an air filter? Come on. But anyway, that's New Zealand hill climbing for you. Fortunately, it did work when we got there. Now, long anecdote. What I wanted to get back to is power density for this nitrous. You mentioned nitromethane, etc. What about fresh air anti-lag? Now, it's something that I haven't personally had the opportunity to play with myself. We've got an in-house project one of my guys is doing, which I'll be into very shortly. But to me, I would imagine less mass involved compared to even the nitrous, albeit as you use up the nitrous, obviously the bottle gets lighter. What are your thoughts?
So that was, I mean, it's just like we're having the same conversation we were having the other day all over again. So I think that the winner, other than fresh air antilag, is probably going to be nitrous. I mean, you maybe could get there with a nitromethane methanol mixed, or nitromethane ethanol and some magical combination of fuel. But then again, you got how much more do you have to hold to be able to run that as the primary fuel source all the way up the hill versus the nitrous? And the nitrous is obviously getting lighter as it goes up the hill a little bit. And then the fresh air antilag thing, was the other way. And so I don't know what that weighs compared to nitrous. And I don't know what other things you may subject the engine to, the exhaust valves, the exhaust system. I don't know what the failure points are of that system compared to just spraying nitrous. And I know nitrous is relatively simple.
I always tried to stay away from using a conventional anti-lag system where possible, because it's just so hard on all of the components, particularly the exhaust valves, the exhaust manifold, the turbine housing, the turbine wheel, the heat it generates. Now, obviously, if you're tuning for rally, you have to have it if you want to be competitive. It kind of is what it is, but obviously they sound cool. So all of the guys with street cars that are turbocharged come in for a tune and want anti-lag, and I'm like, look, I really strongly recommend we don't do that. Yeah, it sounds cool, but honestly, you're going to get pretty sick of replacing everything on the exhaust side of the engine, so let's just not do that. So exhaust gas temperature becomes a real issue. However, from what I understand, I think I was talking to John Reed about this. He's done quite a lot of work with this with Ryan Turk's drift cars, and it sounds like you can control that exhaust gas temperature quite nicely with fuel trimming, but I don't know, I haven't done it personally. For those who maybe aren't kind of picking up the pieces here, can you give us a quick sort of overview of how fresh air anti-lag differs from a conventional anti-lag system where we're just using a throttle bypass or opening the throttle blade?
Yeah, so you have, what you do in fresh air anti-lag is you provide a direct path from the compressor, the turbocharger, straight into the turbine, or into the exhaust leading into the turbine between the engine and the turbocharger. So instead of sending the air through the engine and cutting a cylinder and trying to send air and fuel mixture through the cylinder and through the exhaust and into the turbine, you're just literally sending the air from the compressor straight into the turbo. You're almost making it a self-generating machine, So you have to get fuel, obviously, from the engine in there, and you have to have heat from the exhaust to be able to ignite it. But it's far more effective. If you can imagine, if you had there's for sure videos that you can go look at on YouTube where it's guys running turbochargers using like a 55-gallon drum and wood or whatever, and feeding the compressor boost into the barrel, and that feeds the air to make the fire, to turn the turbine. So it'll basically run itself like a little jet engine. And so if you do that, you can realistically have just about any amount of boost you want. And the engine doesn't really have to know much about what's going on with the turbo, other than it's feeding itself. And as soon as you're ready, you change the fresh air valve to feed the boost to the engine, and it's got almost instantaneous boost. And it's not like a traditional anti-lag setup.
I think the biggest downside with the conventional method is there's a limit to how aggressive you can make the anti-lag, and obviously you need the anti-lag to be aggressive with a large turbocharger to fill in the hole and get it to respond. But to do that, you need to bypass more air through the engine, and of course, as you're burning more air and fuel in the engine, even with cuts, you're going to end up with the engine making more torque. So you sort of get to a point where when the driver gets off the throttle, the car's still going to be pushing. It's actually still going to be driving, and that becomes quite disconcerting, particularly for novice drivers. But I mean, even with an experienced rally driver, there's a limit to how aggressively you can set that up. The fresh air anti-lag gives all of the benefits without that particular downside.
Right, and because you're not sending it through the engine, you're not potentially using the exhaust parts of the engine, the valves and springs and all that stuff as consumables. It's a bit more of its own self-contained system. And I've never had a chance to actually play with one, so all I know is the theory of how they work, of course. But
yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. But I am excited to see how effective it is. Of course, then there's other challenges in terms of how you run that with an ECU that maybe doesn't have a strategy designed specifically for fresh air anti-lag, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Before we move on from Pikes Peak, and I mean, I know we probably discussed this broadly in our last chat, but that was 3 years ago, and people may or may not go back and listen. The barometric air pressure, which we've sort of harped on about here, makes some challenges for our tuning in terms of, the barometric air pressure at the start line is substantially different to what we see at the finish line. And there's a variety of ways that we can deal with this. We've got the ability to maybe have a four-dimensional compensation for barometric air pressure over our VE table, which would be a reasonably straightforward way of doing it. We could let the closed loop Lamda just pick up the pieces and know that the tune's not going to be right. And, that's kind of hitting it with a hammer that'll probably get the job done. Then there's other techniques like using inlet manifold pressure divided by exhaust manifold back pressure as the load axis for our VE table. What's your take on these methods? What do you prefer?
So before I had ever gone to Pikes Peak, my choice was MAP versus EMAP. The trouble with MAP versus EMAP is that sometimes it's hard to implement, like let's say on a drag race car where it does a lot of anti-lag before it leaves the starting line, because it's easy to damage the sensors in the exhaust. And then if you're using that for your main load calculation and they're giving you wrong values or they drop altogether or whatever, then you may as well not have them in the first place. But I had a customer with a land speed motorcycle who was going to run at Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, and he was a local guy. And so we had tuned the engine. It's a GSX-R 1000, with a single turbo and a water to air intercooler on it. And it made, I want to say, something like 450 horsepower at the rear wheel at sea level in Long Beach, California. And he runs this car in the dry lake races in Southern California. The elevation's probably somewhere around 4,000 feet. And at Bonneville, and the elevation's 4,500 feet. But that's sort of nothing compared to what he told me, which was that he was going to 8,000 feet, or maybe it was 9,000 feet at Salar de Uyuni. So he gets there, he loads this thing up, and they go to Bolivia, and then he goes and makes a run with it. And he brings it, and it's like 50 miles across the Salt Lake. They go back to the hotel because it's the only place there's internet. And he sends me, and he emails me the log, and I'm looking at the log, and I'm looking at the GPS altitude, and I'm like, it's fucking like 3,600 meters. That is definitely more than 9,000 feet. What is that? So I go quickly, turn it into feet, something I can understand. Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, 12,900. And I'm like, oh, holy crap. So then I go back and look at the Lambda. I'm looking at everything, and I'm like, it's good. It's good. So, I had professed that, and I had used it at relatively limited altitude levels compared to that. Nothing extreme, right? But it's always nice when reality lines up with the theory, right? So it had gone from sea level, it had been tuned at sea level. It ran MAP versus EMAP. It had run at whatever boost up there at 12,000 feet. And the Lambda was dead on the aim in the same spots that I had been on the table, or places that I had to interpolate on the table because I couldn't get there at sea level. But the point is that it ran appropriately. And so, long way around. But when it came to Pikes Peak, because it was an M1 wouldn't inherently let you do MAP versus EMAP. So I did custom firmware based loosely around GPR and allowed it to have MAP versus EMAP. But also because I hadn't been to Pikes Peak and it was higher than Salar de Uyuni, and I wanted to cover my ass, I also did a 4D VE table. So it does engine efficiency point, which is MAP versus EMAP, which is the load axis. Obviously engine speed, and the fourth dimension is then baro, right? And I figured, look, worst case scenario, I have the same map and I can adjust it by baro and let it float from, once we run the top, we run the bottom, and then I've got some kind of moving target that it'll chase. Plus we could run closed loop.
So it shouldn't need that fourth dimension if IMAP over EMAP works, but then you've got another lever to pull if you have to.
If I'm at the mountain and it doesn't work like it should, or, so we went up there, and so we ran the Porsche the first year, and, sure enough, we got to the top of the mountain, it needed something different. So I adjusted that, I think I have 5 cells. So I have 5 fourth dimensional maps that are MAP versus EMAP versus RPM, and then at different pressure points, depending on where you test, right? The starting line, the middle, the upper. And I made an adjustment to the upper because we started at the upper. And then we ran the next day, we ran the bottom, and I made an adjustment to the one at the bottom. And then we ran the middle, and I made an adjustment to the one at the middle. And then I looked at all of 3 of them, and I went, ooh, these are remarkably close. I wonder if I could just merge them. And so I did, and we tested one more day, or maybe by then we crashed and went back the next year. But over the years, I have now gotten to the point where you can run the same map. It doesn't matter if you have MAP versus EMAP, you can run it at the starting line or the finish line, and it hits the correct air fuel ratio without having an adjustment by baro. Now, having said that, you may be able to get to the same place by doing what I started out doing, which was, it was map versus Z map, but I still was adjusting it by baro. But in the end, the adjustments were almost all the same. I just combined them into one map. So I do have 5 cells in case I need to change it. But in reality, it's the exact same map in all 5 slots.
Like you say, it is nice when the theory kind of actually lines up. The 2 years I was there, we were on production firmware, which, as you say, doesn't have that ability to run IMAP over EMAP. So we were stuck with inlet manifold pressure on the load axis. And I just used baro, and I did exactly what you did. You get 3 data points from the bottom, the middle, and the top. Choose your baro point and well, there's the VE table for that. I mean, hey, it's not quite right, but at the end of the day, if the Lambda follows your target and you don't have massive closed loop swings of, plus or minus 10 to 20%, well, it's working. Why worry about it?
If it doesn't drop out of Lambda control, you're good. So, since now I'm 5 years or 6 years into it, now the way I do it is just to make sure I don't even run Lambda control, not until race day. I just run it open loop and make sure. And that way I'm not trying to figure out, is this a Lambda trim that's happening? And, there's so much cuts. There's so many things going on. It's so difficult with that number of transients. I'm sure it's like drift, trying to tune a drift car. I haven't done very much of that. I helped one guy a little bit, but the data that I saw, it's like, man, how do you make sense of any of this? Everything's moving all the time, like super hard to keep track of. And Pikes Peak is better than that, but it's still got a lot of moving parts every direction. It's easy to steer yourself off, in left field.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that with the running no Lambda control, because you're right. I mean, it's easy to mask what is actually inherently an error with your VE table, and the closed loop's just picking up the pieces. And I think probably it's generated a generation of lazy tuners, because if the VE table isn't quite right, well, that's okay. Closed loop will pick up the pieces and get it right. And yeah, I mean, to a degree it will. I sort of thought back then, as you were saying that, at the start of my tuning career, we didn't have many ECUs with onboard wideband control. There weren't the aftermarket wideband cam-based controllers. I mean, almost every car I tuned had no closed loop, and you'd tune it and you'd send it out into the world, and I mean, they don't come back broken. So, you can do a pretty good job without closed loop Lambda, but would I choose to not have it now? Absolutely not.
No, it's a nice tool to have, but you have to recognize when it's useful. And I do use it. I do use it during race day. That's the only time I run Lambda control. And I'll give it like 5% in or out, just in case something happens that we don't know about. It's not enough to make it run bad if it's got an air leak because the header freaking has a crack in it. And it's not enough to fix it if it's got something, if there's no fuel pressure or something that it can't fix. It's not going to fix that either. It's just to keep it in its little window. And it also is close enough without Lambda control that even if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. It'll run anyway.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the sort of theory I've got behind it. I mean, if you need more than plus or minus 5%, that really means you haven't done your job properly in the first place. Coming back to this IMAP over EMAP, so we've been talking about fuel control, which is really just how the mass airflow into the engine changes from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill. But of course, that has an impact on your ignition timing requirements as well. I'm interested, how are you dealing with the ignition load axis? Are you using IMAP over EMAP for that as well?
No, strictly manifold pressure.
There's no need then to consider IMAP over EMAP?
But there could be, but
you're close enough.
Yeah, so this car, we have more power than we can probably realistically use. And I can certainly make more power by turning the turbo up. So what I'm running is a conservative amount of ignition timing that I know won't break, based on the fact that we've run the car now through four iterations. Well, actually, now we've run it through 7 iterations of going up the hill, or at least almost 7. So we did nearly 3 this time. And the engine stays alive, right? And there's no problems with it, and they take it apart and everything looks good. So it's like, I don't need to push it any harder. Is there a better way to absolutely make peak power at everyone? Of course there is. I'm not sure what the right method would be. I'm not sure what I would choose if I had to do that. But in my mind, it's pretty much manifold pressure and back the timing up with the air temp if you need to. And, if you put enough good enough intercooler on it, you don't need to do that either. So
I think a lot of this also comes down to, when you're tuning on a really good quality fuel. I think you mentioned C16 before, but, E85, NOC probably under most conditions, unless you're sort of really starting to push the limits. Knock's actually not an issue. You can tune to MBT. Maybe you're going to give it a little bit of safety margin there. So yeah, your timing is maybe not as critical as it would be if you're on a shitty grade of pump fuel where you've got to have it pinpoint accurate or you will be running the engine into detonation.
Yeah, 100%. I think we're running one ethanol R, which is like E98 basically, and it's not, we don't have a knock problem. We could certainly make more power than we're generating, especially at the lower part of the mountain. But that's the other thing, is that I try to run, because I have a gentleman driver and because he tests basically at sea level. He lives in Wisconsin. Okay. So he tests at his local road course in Wisconsin where he's got, gobs of power. So I won't ever let him run it with the wastegate. I've got a 3-pound or something like that wastegate spring in it. I have blow-off valve springs that I took out of a sprinkler head when that was a whole nother problem we had a couple of years back at the mountain. But anyway, they were super light. Let me put it this way: super light blow-off valve springs, and I have a control valve that will allow it to open the blow-off valves when he's not demanding power. So we're not spending a bunch of time heating up the air in the intercooler or heating the intercooler up. He's not allowed to run boost control at sea level. He's allowed to have spring boost at sea level. So he's practicing, and the car's geared for, and the power level that we have is something at least similar to what he's going to have on the mountain. Now, it's a much broader power range because the engine displacement at sea level versus the turbo size is much more closely matched for the RPM band we actually use. But when we get to the top of the mountain, we draw this triangle. I was trying to explain to him, turbochargers are kind of like a triangle over the RPM band, right? So you can have one that's not very tall at the top of the RPM band, and then that can start at a really low RPM. So you have that triangle that's real short in height, but it's real broad at the bottom over the top, over the power band. Or you can take that same triangle and turn it the other way, where it's really, it starts almost at the end of the power band, but it goes straight up super high. And so that gives you a bunch of boost at the high RPM and your power level is super high. But you can't ever get one that does both of those. You never get to have one that's broad and high in its height. So what you do is you trade. And so that's effectively what happens when you go up the mountain. You take a triangle that fits pretty broadly left to right and, reasonably up and down. And then you start making it taller, or you cap it off because you limit the boost. So it never gets taller. It just gets narrower. It just starts moving to the right in the RPM band. So like you said, it won't, something that'll spool at 3,000 at sea level won't spool at all until 5,500 when it's at 9,000, 10,000, 12,000 feet. So at sea level, I won't let him run anything more than similar boost to what we make peak up on the mountain. And then I run about 0.7 bar at the starting line, and I run 1 bar at the finish line. I have enough turbo to make it to 1 bar. I can't do anything about the fact that everything moves to the right in the RPM band, right? But I can at least try and offset that somewhat by giving him more power when it finally gets into the RPM band. And what I'm ultimately trying to do by fuel volume is match the power at the starting line, at the finish line. So that's one less variable he's contending with. He doesn't have.
So the car feels the same at the start line as it does at the finish line.
Ultimately, it's at 7,500. Wherever it finally gets on the turbo enough to be on the turbo, he's got the same power at the finish that he starts with. Now, why isn't 1 bar the same? How is 1 bar the same as 0.7 bar? Well, because even though we can make more boost at the top of the mountain, the efficiency is nowhere near as good as it is at the bottom of the mountain, especially not anything like it is at sea level. So we can make 1 bar of boost at the top of the mountain, but our pressure ratio goes, way backwards. The exhaust manifold pressure goes up way higher than the inlet manifold pressure. And so the overall engine volumetric efficiency is down, and the turbocharger isn't as good. And so it takes more manifold pressure to get the same horsepower, or to basically get the same fuel use. And that's how I base it, is the amount of fuel it's using.
Yeah. Now, I was going to save this conversation for our compound turbo chat, but seeing as you raise it here, sort of, in my opinion, boost pressure as a term which everyone wants to sort of compare is kind of almost useless. And you just raise that term pressure ratio, which I think is, particularly if we're looking at compressor efficiency maps, is what you need to know. What's that term mean? What is pressure ratio, and how does that differ from boost pressure?
Well, pressure ratio, when I'm saying pressure ratio, I'm talking about the pressure ratio across the engine. So in other words, the intake manifold pressure divided by the exhaust manifold pressure. And so when I'm saying you have a favorable pressure ratio, what I mean is you have at the very least, you have a 1-to-1 ratio between exhaust manifold pressure and inlet manifold pressure. If it's favorable, it's above that. You have more boost than back pressure. If it's upside down, it's got more exhaust manifold pressure than it has boost. And anytime you're in that situation, I mean, if you think about it in terms of a normally aspirated engine, the only time you would ever be in a situation where you would have more exhaust manifold pressure than boost would be when the throttle's not open. Right. And so what do you expect when you're not opening the throttle? Are you expecting high output from the engine? Of course you're not. And so the reason is because you're reducing the mass airflow through the engine. And that's the key. The whole point of all of these exercises is to increase the mass airflow that the engine can swallow over any given time. And that's where the power comes from. So when you have a reverse pressure ratio, an inverse pressure ratio, a unfavorable pressure ratio, more EMAP than MAP, it's like driving around with the throttle closed. And what's going on is that during the gas exchange process at overlap with high exhaust manifold pressure, there's no reason for the exhaust gas in the cylinder to go out the exhaust. As a matter of fact, if the inlet manifold pressure is below the exhaust manifold pressure, it's more likely that the exhaust will then cross through the combustion chamber and start going back up into the inlet manifold. And as the piston tries to draw air in at overlap with a bunch of exhaust manifold pressure and the valve open, it's going to be drawing in exhaust instead of fresh air. And so some proportion of the cylinder swept volume will be filled with a gaseous mixture of exhaust, which won't combust, air, and some amount of fuel. And if you can actually experiment with this pretty easily. If you just even let an engine idle and watch the air fuel ratio and then start plugging the exhaust pipe up, literally plugging the exhaust pipe with a valve or your foot or whatever. And you can see the mixture just dive in the rich direction. And eventually the engine speed will drop, right, as the efficiency goes down. And you're basically just making the engine displacement less. It's not physically displacing less, but you're taking your cylinder, whatever swept volume the cylinder has, and reducing the useful work you can get out of it because you're filling it with shit that won't burn.
You can't fill that volume that's now exhaust gas with fresh air and fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the favorable situation is, and here's the other problem. It gets worse and worse with higher engine speed because you run out of time to flush things out. And typically with more engine speed, you gain more exhaust manifold pressure because the exhaust flow starts outrunning what the turbo can get rid of through the turbine. And so so a turbocharged engine compared to, a supercharged engine typically doesn't do as good of a job at running high RPM unless the turbo's sized appropriately. But of course, we all want our cake and eat it too, which means we want the turbo to work good at 3,000 RPM, and we also want it to work good at 10,000 RPM. And there just isn't one that does that.
We've gone in a different direction with this, but that's absolutely fine because this is important information. I think the bit that is worth mentioning here is there is no kind of magic number of what that pressure ratio should be of IMAP versus EMAP because it depends on the application. What I mean by that is if we look at what that ratio looks like for maybe a factory production turbocharged car, it wouldn't be unheard of to see the exhaust manifold pressure maybe double boost pressure, double inlet manifold pressure. And there's an element of sizing that turbocharger for the power desired, but more importantly for an OE application is they want response. So that by definition then increases the drive pressure of the turbocharger, aiding response, but it kills top-end performance because your EMAP's just running away with all of the things you just said before. The flip side of that is I look back at my old drag car, and when we were developing that, granted the turbo technology is nothing like what it is now, but at 45 or 50 psi of boost pressure, the exhaust manifold pressure was still marginally below that. Maybe at 50 psi inlet pressure, I had 48 psi exhaust manifold pressure. So I was on the right side of that line, but, I had a turbocharger that didn't do shit until we got to like 7,000 RPM. So, not probably suited to your daily driver. So it does come down to application specifics, doesn't it?
Yeah, you have to define what your goal is, right? So, but what you can say is that in every single case, if your goal is peak output, always more inlet manifold pressure than exhaust pressure is desirable. There are reasons why, and we're leading into this earlier with the production engine. Yes, the production engine will always typically, when it's at peak RPM and peak output, will have more exhaust manifold pressure than intake manifold pressure. That's not because that's the correct way to do the job at that specific point. It's because they have other concerns that they're trying to hit. Always, always, always big turbo, which is the case of your drag engine, little engine is the most effective, most efficient way to run a turbocharged engine. You start looking at power per displacement. That's why the bike engines almost always kill everything, because it's very easy to get a turbo that's way big and an engine that's way small. And then you get just nearly unbelievable power numbers that can come out of it compared to the opposite way, effectively tractor engines, big engine, small turbo, works good over a small RPM range. It's stuffed inside out, when it's revved up, power per inch is way down. But the one thing you can always say is that peak performance is your goal. Always more intake manifold pressure than exhaust pressure is desirable.
Yeah. That's absolutely been my experience with it as well. All right, so to come back to the angle of that question I was actually talking about, and what you've just covered was definitely a valuable addition. So if we're just looking at the compressor itself and we're talking about compressor pressure ratio instead of boost pressure, which is what everyone talks about. So what we're talking about here, and this really becomes much more critical at Pikes Peak because the inlet pressure at the compressor inlet is lower because of our barometric pressure. So pressure ratio, we're looking at the compressor outlet pressure divided by the compressor inlet pressure. And that's going to be the axis we're going to see on the left-hand side of a compressor map. So why is that an important metric to be considering when we're looking at our turbo performance, and particularly at the likes of Pikes Peak or anywhere with altitude?
Well, because for any given boost pressure or any given inlet manifold pressure, as you reduce the inlet pressure to the turbo effectively thinks it's making more boost because it's starting at a lower pressure and ending at the same pressure. And so, for example, at Pikes Peak, I said we run 1 bar of boost, and we do run 1 bar absolute boost. So it's 200 kPa in the intake manifold, but that's almost 3.3 to 1 pressure ratio because the ambient pressure is 62 kPa. So what the compressor knows is that it's compressing 3 to 1. So to put that in sea level terms, 2 to 1 would be 15 pounds of boost or 1 bar. And 3 to 1 is, obviously 3 bar absolute. And so the turbocharger thinks it's making 33 pounds of boost, even though the resultant pressure in the intake manifold is only 1 bar, 15 pounds of boost, because we're starting with almost nothing to begin with, 60% of what we should be. And so the efficiency of the compressor determines the temperature output and the amount of power it takes to drive the compressor to get to that pressure ratio. And so the same horsepower it takes to make 15 pounds of boost, turning that compressor at sea level, it goes way up as you go up in altitude because the turbo, again, thinks it's trying to make twice as much boost as you see in your manifold pressure gauge. And so you lose the efficiency and it takes a lot more power to turn it.
I think what I probably wanted to get out of that, which you've answered in a roundabout way, is that if we hold the same inlet manifold pressure, so the same boost pressure from the start line to the finish line or sea level to 14,000 feet, but we consider what's happening to the pressure at the inlet to the turbocharger, the further we go up in altitude, the lower the barometric pressure is, our pressure ratio increases. So if we look at how that plots on a compressor map, we do need to be careful because depending on our turbocharger size, even at the same 1 bar of boost pressure in the inlet manifold, it could be quite easy to end up basically out of efficiency or past the surge line on a compressor map at altitude, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. But the same as if you just ran, if you ran anything at sea level and you went from 1 bar of boost from 15 pounds to 33 pounds, it'd be the same, it'd run over the same line.
The other thing I think it's easy to sort of forget the fact that even at sea level, we're probably going to have some level of restriction in the intake. So even at sea level, we're probably not getting 101.3 kPa at the inlet to the turbocharger. So even then, and it gets worse obviously with more restrictive inlets, restrictive air filters. So even then, you can be actually skewing your pressure ratio more than you'd think. I think it's easy just to not even consider it.
So the compressor is responding to the air density in the front leading edge of it. And just like the engine, that's a combination of pressure and temperature. So temperature is a huge factor. And I think it relatively often gets overlooked. You'll see turbochargers with the air inlet sucking air through an air filter behind the radiator in the engine, and that's, you might as well be making the turbo smaller. It becomes less efficient as you reduce the air density. It becomes way more efficient as you increase the air density.
It was quite interesting. We were just having a brief chat before we started recording about turbo compressor efficiency, and I mentioned to Shane that with our Toyota 86 that had the FA20 turbo engine in it, we had a Motec M1 with a custom package firmware there, and I actually went to the trouble of writing some code to basically calculate the adiabatic efficiency of the turbo compressor, and to do that, we needed pre and post compressor temperature sensors, and they needed to be fast acting, and then pre and post turbocharger map sensors so we could work out the pressure ratio. That worked incredibly well, albeit you had to be at steady state for something like maybe a minute until everything actually reached equilibrium. But the numbers, I think, from my calculation, worked out to be within 1 or 2% of what Borg Warner had on their EFR maps. So, I mean, it proved the effect. Would you drive the car like that? No, absolutely not. But for the purposes of testing, it was effective.
So I have pre-compressor inlet pressure and temperature on that car because I'm working with Zona Rudder, and Robert Young had specifically designed compressors and turbine wheels for this application. And every year we go to Pikes Peak, and then after Pikes Peak, we have a little data dump, and we talk about, looking at the compressor efficiency, the overall efficiency of the turbocharger, and trying to decide what adjustments we need to make for next year. So I have that data from the Pikes Peak car.
Right. I'm a bit of a data nerd. More data is better, but also, I guess, when you're maybe new to data analysis, it can be very overwhelming if you've got a million sensors on the car too. Obviously, that's for a very specific purpose in your case.
That's true. But the good news about logging too much stuff is that if someday in the future you finally are able to understand what that data means, you have it. Versus one day later you go, oh man, I wish I had, and particularly something like Pikes Peak where you got to wait till next year to get the data.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, even if you do have all of that data, it doesn't mean that you have to display it on your data analysis package. You can have a simple worksheet that's only got a handful of parameters and, analyze that. I just want to take a moment out of our chat with Shane and talk about a package that's going to be perfect for any of you listening who want to start tuning for yourself. And that, of course, is our tuning starter package. Normally valued at $417 US. You can use the coupon code ShaneT100. That'll get you $100 off, bring it down to just $317 US. This package starts with our EFI Tuning Fundamentals course, which will teach you the core tuning principles and techniques you'll need to understand in order to be able to tune any engine on any ECU platform. This will teach you how the engine responds to both fuel and ignition, as well as what we as tuners are trying to do when we're optimizing these parameters. Moving on, we're also including our Understanding Air-Fuel Ratio course, which I believe is one of the most misunderstood topics in the world of EFI tuning. You'll learn what air-fuel ratio is. We'll give you some safe starting air-fuel ratios so you can get your engine up and running with zero risk of damage. And then most importantly, we'll teach you how to find the optimal air-fuel ratio for your engine and your form of motorsport. Moving on from these, we then jump into our practical tuning courses. We've got two courses here. The first is perfect for those of you who want to learn how to tune aftermarket standalone ECUs. That, of course, is our practical standalone tuning course. For those who want to learn how to tune the factory-fitted ECU that came in your late model car, we're also including our practical reflash tuning course. Both of these courses are completely generic, so it doesn't matter what engine you're tuning and it doesn't matter what ECU platform you're tuning on, we've got you covered. I know that it can be a bit daunting when it comes to tuning your first car, or even your 10th for that matter, and for this reason both of these courses break the tuning process down into the HPA step-by-step process. By doing this, each of the individual steps is relatively quick and easy to complete, and in no time you've got to the end, you've got a completely tuned engine that's delivering great power, great torque, and most importantly, great reliability. Following this process from start to finish is also going to ensure that you don't overlook any critical steps that could waste time, waste money, or even potentially damage your expensive engine. Both of these courses are broken into two parts. This is the body of the course that I've just been talking about, and once you've gone through there, we move into our library of worked examples, and this is an informal walkthrough of that step-by-step process. Here, we vary both the type of engine and car that we're tuning, as well as the ECU platform we're tuning on, so that you can get experience on a broad range of platforms. This package also comes with 24 months of gold membership, which gives you access to our private members-only forum. This is the best place to get trustworthy answers to your specific tuning questions. You'll also get access to our live weekly webinars, where we pick a particular topic. It might be on tuning, wiring, it might be engine building, or 3D modeling, or anything in between for that matter. And we'll dive deep into that for around about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. But if the time zone doesn't work for you, you can rewatch these in our archive where we've got over 350 hours of existing content. Total value of this package is actually $1,100 US. As I mentioned, it's normally $417 US, and you can use that coupon code ShaneT100, bring it down to just $317 US. You still get to break that payment down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments at the checkout if you want to make it as affordable as we can. And of course, you are still protected with our 60-day, no questions asked money back guarantee. So if for any reason you decide it's not quite what you expected, let us know. You'll get a full refund of the purchase price. As usual, we'll leave the coupon code in the show notes to make it easy for you to find. Let's get back to our interview now. Anyway, let's move on. I'm going to do this a little bit out of order, seeing as we've sort of gone deep down the rabbit hole of turbochargers already. Let's continue that. And one of the reasons that we wanted to get you back on the podcast is because last time we talked to you, you were kind of in the early stages of testing or about to go testing with the MazWorks compound turbo SR20 drag engine, and you had some pretty bold claims, and if anyone else had been claiming them I'd have called bullshit. But when Shane says he's going to make 3,000 horsepower from a 4-cylinder engine, you tend to sort of take notice and believe it. So for a start, can you maybe give us a quick kind of catch up, bring us up to speed with what compound turbocharging is, and specifically why you needed to go down that route in order to try and hit these 3,000 horsepower numbers on a small capacity 4-cylinder engine?
So compound turbocharging or multi-stage turbocharging is, it's been around for a long time. It's not anything new, but the concept is to take the outlet of one turbocharger and feed it into the inlet of a second turbocharger, because the turbocharger takes whatever the pressure leading into the inlet of it is and multiplies it by a ratio, hence the pressure ratio. When you take the first turbocharger and let the air come in at ambient and let it come out at 30 pounds, and that's 3-to-1 pressure ratio. If you then feed it into another turbocharger at 3-to-1 and multiply that by 3-to-1, you get 3 times 3 out of the second turbocharger. And so it's a really good way to spread the load of creating high boost pressure between 2 stages or 2 compressors. And that then keeps the 2 compressors operating in the center of their efficiency map, which gives you the most amount of boost pressure with the least amount of temperature rise, and also with the least amount of horsepower required to generate that pressure. And so that's the concept of compound turbocharging. And in reality, if you don't have a size limitation or a weight limitation, in theory, you could stack however many of these things together you wanted, and you could stick another one on the backside of the one that was 9, and you would then get effectively 9 times 3, right? Or 27-to-1 pressure ratio. So 27 times atmospheric pressure worth of boost. Now, the engine has to be able to contain whatever it is you can create without blowing itself apart. And so that becomes the trick. It's not a problem to make a bunch more boost than you can actually use. And in the sport compact drag racing world, where I had played for a number of years, we were always trying to stretch to the absolute limit the amount of pressure ratio we could get out of a single stage turbo. And for the most part, you're limited to about 6 or maybe 7-to-1 pressure ratio with a single stage. You just simply cannot make more than that without damaging the turbo, or you have such a huge amount of loss because the temperature of the air is extremely hot, and the amount of power it takes to turn the turbo hard enough to get it to pressurize to that point with one stage is so high that you can't get enough efficiency to make any more power. And so I had the opportunity one time through the team MazWorks Technotoys race team to invite someone to the racetrack who pretty much asked me, what's the craziest thing you could think to do with one of these cars? And I said, I think, a compound turbocharger would be awesome. And I think you could we're making 2,000 horsepower with 1-stage turbo now. I don't see why you couldn't put compounds on it, raise the inlet pressure on the turbo by a half an atmosphere, and make 3,000 horsepower. Just by math, it ought to work. So, but listen, we'd been drinking beers too, so it seemed like it made a lot more sense then too. But so the bottom line is, he said, okay, let's try it. So that's how the compound thing started. We went to the engine dyno to try it. And in the end, they started putting a car together for it. And it took a long time for the car to get done. And so now Team Technotoys has now taken over the project. And so we've now been to the hub dyno with it. And so that's how compound turbocharging generally works, and that's how I got into it.
All right. So I think probably one of the first areas of disbelief is going to be for people with this 3,000 horsepower number. So I mean, really, the turbochargers, the compound turbo setup is there just to supply the engine with the mass of air that it needs to make 3,000 horsepower. So we still need an engine that is going to be mechanically strong enough to support the sort of cylinder pressures that are required to make 3,000 horsepower. I'd almost consider that a separate sort of consideration, and what we're really focusing on here is just how to get that air mass into the engine, which of course is the compound turbo setup. So last time I talked, you hadn't hit the dyno. You have now, as you just mentioned. So what was the learning curve? How did everything work out in reality compared to the theory, and what were the sort of the wins and fails on the day?
So now, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back on it in several years, I think we probably ran the compound engine 4 years ago, and on the engine dyno. So we were, firstly, we wanted to just try it and see, hey, maybe this isn't going to work how we think it should work. But, just the general theory of it, like you were saying, forget the engine. How much air mass do you need to make 3,000 horsepower? We need 3,000 horsepower worth of air. So how are we going to get there when we have a turbo that can only supply 2,000 horsepower worth of air? Well, we need a bigger turbo, right? Forget the engine again. We just need to move 50% more mass. And how can we do that? So, at that time, I didn't know of any single turbocharger that was going to be able to supply that mass flow to the engine. So I figured, well, what if we just use two of the ones we have now? They can obviously move 4,000 horsepower worth of air. So we ought to be able to turn them way down and deliver, 3,000 horsepower of air with them to the single turbo that's already moving 2,000 horsepower worth of air. And that gives us the opportunity to, basically put 50% more mass through the same size hole. We ought to get 50% more horsepower. Yeah, obviously the engine has to contain it and the efficiency has to be there and all that other stuff. But just, on a napkin,
it should work.
It should work. So, I was very worried about this whole concept of that you can have incredibly, I mean, if you lose control of the turbos, in theory, and we're using turbos that we already know per stage are capable of 5 or 6 to 1, we start having two stages that are accidentally making 5 to 1, it's 25 to 1, and you can quickly get out of control and blow something up easy. So I was very, very scared about the boost control part of it, having never done it before.
Am I right in assuming on that basis, the key there is going to be very careful management of the, essentially, I guess you'd call it the boost pressure at the inlet to the second turbocharger?
Yeah, well, so that was the whole thing. I wasn't 100% sure which way it was going to work. And so in order to make sure that we couldn't be stuck in a hole, I ended up with two wastegates between the high pressure turbo, which would be the turbo that would be in the place that it normally is, right by the engine. Kind of have to work this backwards. So if you come out of the engine into the header like normal, go into the first turbine, that's the high pressure turbine, the high pressure turbo, because that turbo is the one that's going to deliver the highest amount of boost pressure. I always say it the other way around. That's the one that's ultimately going to deliver the compounded boost to the engine. And so then you have a normal wastegate, right, which would usually go to atmosphere and then come out of that turbine and go to atmosphere. But instead of doing that, you route those two together and stick them into another pair of turbines, which are the low pressure turbines. And each one of them has a wastegate to bypass around them to atmosphere. So if you bypass around the first turbo near the engine, what comes out of the wastegate goes into the manifold that feeds to the second set of turbos, which are really the low pressure turbos. And so then you have a wastegate for each one of those. So you can control these two stages individually. And I was really worried. That's why I ended up doing two wastegates. But it turned out in the end, in practice, I didn't really need two wastegates because you have an incredible amount of pressure drop across the high pressure turbo. And so you can get the volume through a single wastegate. I didn't need two. So I learned that. The big mistake I had made initially was that I referenced everything to intake manifold pressure. And so I struggled for, probably 6 or 8 dyno pulls to get the low pressure turbos to do anything because it would blow. I had also like literally 3-pound springs in all the wastegates. So this thing could easily make zero boost with all the wastegates open. You just didn't have enough airflow to get any turbine to do anything. The problem was that, with the resultant manifold pressure of 45 pounds, the front turbochargers are only generating, let's say, 6 or 7 pounds of boost, but you're using 45 pounds to open their wastegates. Their wastegates are basically wide open. You don't have any way to shove them closed. And I realized, oh shit, this is stupid. I need to reference the wastegate pressure to the stage pressure. So if the front turbochargers are generating 7.5 pounds of boost, let's use that as the source pressure to lift the wastegates open. And once I did that, bang, it started working like a normal boost control would work. I mean, I had them completely separate in the ECU, so I could set one to any boost number I wanted and the other to any boost number I wanted, and I was working off of pressure ratio. And it took a little bit of adjustment to offset the two between each other so that I could get them to both generate the same pressure ratio. But once I did, then I could just move them up by percentage and it would climb 1-to-1. So that ended up being awesome also. The struggle we had on the engine dyno was that with a single turbo, the thing would spool at about 7,000. So to make a dyno pull, the water brake has to take all the load off the engine so it can rev up to 7,000. Then it applies load to stop it from accelerating. You wait till the boost comes up and then start the dyno pull, and then there you go. With the compounds, we had enough extra stuff, even though the engine was the same, it would not generate any boost until about 8,000. And the dyno struggled to take enough water away from the engine because it's so weak. With no turbochargers, this engine probably makes 90 horsepower at 8,000.
Yeah. So it just couldn't actually get it up there.
The dyno could. So what we ended up doing, we go to the inlet valve that feeds water into the dyno on the wall in the dyno room and start closing the water valve down. Okay, restrict the water flow to the dyno to get enough water away from the water brake that the engine can accelerate to the RPM that you want to start the dyno pull at. But then, of course, if the valve has got all the water closed off, when it makes boost, it's, the dyno's then got 300 horsepower worth of water to try and control a 2,000 horsepower engine. So the engine just runs away from the dyno right onto the rev limiter.
Yeah. Really the wrong tool for the job in that application.
It was the wrong tool for the job. And it let us experiment a little bit, and we were able to make, I think I had a map sensor that would go to, at a 10 bar map. So it'd go 135 pounds of boost. I could max that out, no problem, but we could never get a power reading out of it because it would just go right on the rev limiter and do effectively a burnout on the dyno. So the plan was to come back and use the ECU and let the ECU control the water feed to the dyno by boost. So turn the valve off, let the engine rev to 8,000, let the dyno grab it, and then turn the water valve on using the ECU, and then let the dyno do a normal dyno sweep, and then we can make full power. But meantime, they built a car, and we never went back to the engine dyno. So since then, it's been on the hub dyno.
It's interesting. I remember when I first started getting involved with tuning, and I've used a chassis dyno a bunch of times. And at that time, for me, the engine dyno was kind of the holy grail, and I just never had the opportunity to use one. And granted, I wasn't sort of on anything flash, like a Superflow or something like that, something genuinely good. It was some prehistoric water brake dyno that was down in Christchurch, and I was tuning a Marathon jet boat motor. It was a supercharged Buick V6, and I was on a Motec 100 series, and I had the dyno controller sitting beside me. I was like, yeah, all right, so I want to go to this cell, and he's like opening a tap and pulling a lever, and basically after about 3 minutes of watching him just trace a big circle around the cell that I wanted, I was like, well, clearly this is not going to work for steady state. So we sort of resorted to some wide open throttle pulls, and he's watching a needle and then picking up a conversion chart, and it's like, oh yeah, that was 700 horsepower. I'm like, was it? No, I don't believe that. No consistency. I then used another water brake dyno that had at least been converted to digital control. And it was better, but it still wasn't great. I mean, I've come off the back of using a Dynapack hydraulic hub dyno with, just split-second instantaneous control. It actually works. And now we have a mainline hub dyno which does the same but can support heaps more power. And so for me, that was actually quite disappointing. I'd looked forward to tuning on a water brake engine dyno, and it just was a complete letdown. And obviously, as you're mentioning there, some challenges. I digress though. Let's get back to the hub dyno experience. So where are we at with this project now?
So the last time we went to the hub dyno was January, I think. We wound up making 2,060, I think, at the rear axle, and I was like milliseconds away from realizing where so here's the deal. We made 2,007, and I've been working this the whole time, trying to run these two sets of turbos in their perfect, efficiency map and all this stuff, and we're just not getting the result. 2,000 is nothing to shake a stick at, of course, but we make that with one turbo. We don't need 3 turbos and all this other bullshit.
You've just added a whole shitload of complexity and weight and all of this to make the same power.
Yeah. So as an experiment, I think we had made 2007 at like 96 pounds of boost. So I thought, maybe it needs the front turbos to run faster. In other words, maybe I need to be making more of the pressure with the low speed turbo than the high speed turbo or the high pressure turbo. Or maybe I need to be making more of the boost with the high pressure turbo and less of it with the low pressure turbo. So let me try speeding up the low pressure turbo a little bit because it's going too slow compared to the high pressure turbo, both in speed and in pressure ratio. I'm using CO2 boost control at this point because it's going in a drag car anyway. So I stick more CO2 on the front turbos to speed those up, and we make a pull. And it makes, I want to say, like 108 pounds of boost, like 115 pounds of back pressure. Back pressure gets stupid. And it makes like 1,860 horsepower.
Okay, so that's the wrong way.
And I'm like, damn, didn't like that.
No.
But if it didn't like that, then maybe it will like the other thing. So now I'm like licking my chops. I can't wait, right? Like, hurry up and cool it off. Like, get it ready to go again. I have a new idea. Now I know the right direction. So I just wanted to dip my toe and test the water a little bit. I didn't want to just go all in. And so I sped the high pressure turbo up from the previous run that made 2007 a little bit. And I slowed the low pressure turbo back down to where it was. And we made a pull, and it made 103 pounds of boost. It had like 105 pounds of back pressure, and it made 2,060. Now, at the same time, we were struggling with a crank trigger that was, we were losing the crank trigger for some reason. Because the bracket was flopping around on the front of the engine. Yeah, so anyway, so we lose the crank trigger, so we can't rev the thing all the way up. Like, it's losing the crank trigger at, I don't remember what, 12,000 or 11. Yeah, I think 12,000. Like, okay, now I'm on the path. I know this is the right way. And just thinking back logically, if you want to make 3,000 horsepower, you take a 2,000 horsepower engine and you increase the mass flow by 50%. That gives you 3,000.
Logical.
Because I lost that between the time when I wrote that on the napkin and until the moment when I decided to go the wrong way around with the turbos. And went, well, duh. What I'm doing is I'm running a turbo, a 1,000 horsepower engine, because based on the pressure ratio that the high pressure turbo is making, 3-to-1, I'm making 1,000 horsepower engine, and then I'm trying to make it make 3,000 horsepower, and I'm only adding, an atmosphere and a half to that one. What I need to do is go back to the engine that makes 2,000 horsepower, which is a 5-to-1, 5.5-to-1 pressure ratio on the high pressure turbo, and don't touch it anymore. Leave it, and then just raise the pressure slowly on the low pressure turbos until I get my 3,000 horsepower. And that was the dipping the toe in the water. I had to go the wrong way first before it finally clicked, and then I went just a little bit the right way. And I was like, okay, I got it now. Get ready. And then, of course, we went to start it for the next pull, and there's water coming out of the header on the ground. So, and we killed it. And so we stopped and decided we needed to go see. At this point, we made 30 dyno pulls. So it was worth taking it back to shop and let's go figure out what's wrong with it and regroup and all that stuff. But they took the motor apart, and the bottom, there's nothing wrong with the bottom end. It had cracked the exhaust port, and one of the exhaust ports had a water leak. And so then it's like, okay, well, now I know. Just put the head back on and we'll go. But there's a whole bunch of side things going on with that. One of them is that the guy that owns the car is from Trinidad, and his visa expired to come back to the US. So now we got to wait for him to be able to get that reinstated before he can come back, before we can go back to the dyno. But the concept is go back to the dyno one time. I don't even care if it makes 3,000 horsepower at this point. First of all, when I said 3,000, I meant at the crank, because we had a 2,000 horsepower engine that we were running on an engine dyno. I definitely think we can make 3,000 horsepower at the crankshaft. That's probably, say, I don't know, if we get to 25, 26, even 2,700 will be fantastic. But any of those numbers, and then in the end, at this point, we need to go run the car. So no matter what it makes next time we go to the dyno, it'll be whatever it is. I don't care if it makes 3,000 horsepower. It'll make enough to prove that it's worth the juice is worth the squeeze.
Yeah, and I think that the reality of this is it's kind of an experiment for you and the team to actually figure out, how does this work? Does it stack up with the theory? And then, as you mentioned, is the juice on this worth the squeeze? Because there is a significant amount of complexity and additional weight over that single turbo setup. There's a lot going on, and I'd probably urge people to jump on Shane's Instagram, and we'll maybe put some links to some actual photos of this car. Because the fabrication and the whole setup, it is an absolute work of art.
Yeah, that made its way all around the social media everywhere, and so that thing's got thousands of views with people with all kinds of opinions about it, and typical internet stuff. They're usually wrong about almost all of it, but yeah, everyone probably will recognize that when they see a photo of it.
I was just thinking, while I was talking there, while you were talking there, we actually had the fabricator who did all of the exhaust manifolds on the podcast at some point. So I want to say
JT Oliver.
JT Oliver. And again, we'll probably link to that podcast episode if people want to find out more about that. All right, let's move on. I think we've done compound turbos to death. And again, before we started recording, you mentioned that another interesting project you've been involved with was some Reno air race aircraft and tuning, which I'm very interested to hear a little bit more about that. I mean, when we think of aircraft, and I mean, I'm involved at a private pilot license level, flying the likes of Piper Tomahawks, Piper Cherokees, and Cessna 172s with some geriatric, agricultural, continental, and Lycoming pieces of shit with zero technology and a total of 0 fuel injectors. So anything we can do to get a little bit more efficiency and performance out of these engines, I'm interested. So yeah, give us a rundown. What are these aircraft and what are the engines for a start?
Well, these are not that. I mean, in fact, these things are, so what I was working on is called a Thunder Mustang. So it is if I get this right, it is a 7/8 scale fuselage, 3/4 scale wing of a P-51 Mustang, but it's all carbon fiber. So, I mean, it's kind of F1-ish. And then instead of using, the P-51 engine, they're using a cast aluminum V12 Falconer engine, which was based on a splayed valve small block Chevy with a 400-inch displacement. So the engines come out. It's got 50% more displacement than a 400, so it's a 600 cubic inch V12, 4 1/8 bore, 3 3/4 stroke, splayed valve cylinder head. Cast aluminum, normally aspirated, cross ram intake manifold, fuel injected. I don't know how many more descriptive terms I can get in there, but okay, because it's an aircraft, at some point for redundancy, or in theory redundancy, they decided that they would run it as 2 inline sixes. So it's got an ECU for the left bank and an ECU for the right bank. Each one controls 6 cylinders. They have the crank triggers. It's a complete system. Each one has its own crank sensor, its own cam sensor, its own injectors, throttle position, manifold pressure, coolant sensor, air temp, all the stuff you need to run the engine, and it has on each side of the engine. So the theory was, if one side died, the other side, you could at least, get down and land reasonably.
I mean, a little bit of redundancy in an aircraft goes a long way, because obviously you don't get to pull off to the side of the sky and call a tow truck. These things can have some pretty serious consequences depending where exactly you run out of engine. And sometimes it's not going to be possible to get the thing back on the ground safely. So yeah, redundancy, pretty damn important.
That's exactly why he had gotten in touch with me, because he had run the Reno Air Race the year before and kicked the rods out of one and then landed it dead stick. And effectively, I mean, he didn't crash it into the ground, but he crashed it on the way to the ground, hit a pole, knocked the back of the plane off. I mean, he got his wake-up call, and the reason he called me was because he said, look, I'm talking with all the guys that are involved with these planes and that have done this for 30 years with these engines, controllers, all these things. And they're telling me this is the best it can be. And I need someone else to look at it and tell me what they think. That's not racing, that's not been involved with it, that doesn't know. I just want, could I just pay you to look and see what you think? And okay, I'll look. And anyways, I was interested and always wanted to be part of that venue anyway. So here's my opportunity. And so he sends me the data, and I'm like, right. So the first thing, I look through the map, and I'm like, I mean, it's not the worst I've ever seen, but there's some stuff that I'm not sure about. So I'm writing down things that I can see that.
Actually, I'm going to assume this comes to you with a Motec on it. Am I right here?
Yeah, let me backspace. So it's got 2 M600s, one for each side of the engine, which is the old gold box Motec. And so I'm like, send me the data, and he has the GPS does some logging, logs EGTs and fuel flow and prop speed and all kinds of cool stuff that comes to you in an Excel spreadsheet, and you got to try and figure out how to sift through the data to look at it meaningfully. So anyway, he sends me that, and he sends me the data log from one ECU. So I'm like, okay, I need the data from the other ECU. Can't get the data. Why? Doesn't have logging. Why doesn't it have logging? I don't know. It should have logging, and it doesn't. So then there's a struggle to figure out why it doesn't have logging. And in the end, we get the thing upgraded so it's got logging. Unfortunately, the logging isn't there from when this thing blew up. And of course, guess which one was the side of the engine that blew up? The one without any logging.
Right. Yeah, naturally.
So I can't see anything obvious in the data that would have made it blow up. I can see some stuff that's probably not hunky-dory, but nothing obvious that would have caused it to fail. So we get the logging done. He has a second engine. He puts a second engine in the plane. We start talking about things, tuning, things like that. How do you tune it? Blah, blah, blah. And starts sending me data logs. I mean, he was already flying the plane when he got in touch with me with the new engine in it. So he goes up and he flies it around. He sends me a log. Now we've got logs from both halves of the engine, And I start looking, the first thing I notice is, man, the manifold pressure on one bank is way different than the manifold pressure on the other bank. The throttle positions, they're not that far apart. So this must have a leak somewhere. And there's air temps way different on one side, and a whole bunch of stuff's just not the same. So I said, wait, get this thing back down on the ground, go back into your hangar, and let's go start testing some things and see if we can find anything. So the first thing was, oh, that was the other deal. So he lands and shuts the plane off at the end of the data log, and the manifold pressure goes to 108 kPa, I think, when he shuts the engine off. And the baro is reading whatever, 82 or something. This guy's at altitude. He's in Reno. So I'm going, the calibration must be wrong. So all right, so hold on. Let me get live with this thing and let's go. Tell me which one is the labeled manifold pressure? It's this one. Okay, unplug the connector. Let me look at the voltage. I can say, okay, well, guess what? That one's coming into the wire that goes to the baro sensor. And the baro sensor is coming into the wire that says map sensor. And so they've got them misprogrammed in the ECU. And so then on top of that, they've got the calibration backwards so that neither of those. And then I started having them follow the hoses, and they've got the hoses because it's a cross ram intake manifold. The plenum over the right side of the engine feeds the left side, and the plenum over the left side feeds the right side. And so now you can start imagining all of the ways that you could cross shit up, right? So in the end, we spend a couple of weeks, because it's one piece at a time. Like, check the air temp sensor. Oh yeah, of course, that one's going to the wrong side of the motor. And then the configs thankfully they're close enough. They meant the Craig sensor is offset by the same angle, by the bank angle, right? So that the same reference or CRIP or reference offset position.
Base ignition timing.
Yes, it's still in time because the configs in the ECU in the end, they're also crossed. I mean, every way you could cross this thing up, it's been crossed, and he's been flying it this way.
It's a miracle that he didn't lose another engine. Wow. I can see how you could get that far wrong, but also you should be dealing with someone who understands what they're dealing with enough to not get it wrong. There's no real excuse for that.
It's been passed through multiple hands over 30 years. And so everybody's learning almost over again or a little bit. No one necessarily really understands how it's supposed to be. They just look at it and go, yeah, that's how they all are. Like, that's normal. So I'm going, that is sure as hell it's not normal. So, we fix these things and, lo and behold, the plane starts running better and he's happier flying it around. But we have no real reference. There's no Lambda. We're just kind of going by what it feels like, what the RPM trace looks like. They have a governor on the prop that will adjust the pitch of the prop to suit the load and power of the engine and to keep the engine RPM at the same speed, because it's important to keep the tip of the propeller from going supersonic. And so they regulate the engine speed to control the propeller tip speed. So we effectively were using that like a dyno. I would go make an adjustment and then he'd go try and cruise at a certain speed. And then we'd look at the RPM that it achieved. And if the RPM was greater, we knew we were making more power. But really what we were trying to just get the drivability right and things that didn't make sense in the data right. We did a lot of work moving grounds around to get it where the battery voltage trace looked normal and the alternators were outputting the same voltage, because it actually had two batteries. It's effectively two cars. It just has a common crankshaft. Fuel pressure, all this stuff. The manifold pressure thing continued to be a problem. I complained over and over again that the manifold pressure and the throttle blade angle couldn't possibly match each other. And they're telling me, look, we're measuring it with a feeler gauge and we're doing all this stuff with a gauge block. And I'm like, man, there's no way. So eventually finally says, look, why don't you just fly up here and look at the plane? So I fly up there. So about the first thing I do is I go grab the throttles, and the throttle shaft's worn out. So that's how we're getting, no matter what they do with the blade by setting it with gauge block or whatever, it's leaking enough air around the throttle shafts that the manifold pressures are out of whack. And you could get them right, and then as soon as you move it, they're wrong again.
It is one of those situations where sometimes remote just doesn't give you all of the senses that you need to find these things. Unless you're dealing with a customer who has enough mechanical understanding to pick something like that up, how else are you going to pick that up?
Right. Here's the reason it wasn't working, because there was other planes up there also equally worn out. And so the guys that had other planes went, yeah, it's normal. That's how they all are. Right. So there's that. And then let's see, that when I got there, the throttle shaft's worn out, and they're telling me this is normal. That's how they all are. And I'm like, this is bullshit. There's no way that it's obviously worn out. It's not normal. And if every one of them is this way, then they're all worn out. No. All the other planes run good. Like, no, they can't possibly run good. If you don't check, then of course they don't run good, or they do run good. It happens that the neighbor, like across the field at the airport, has another one of these planes and another engine. And so we go over there for something, and I can't remember what we went over there for, but I'm wandering around the shop looking at this second blown up engine that's on the shelf. And as I'm looking at it, I notice, shit, there's an intake manifold right there with two brand new looking, these are BBK throttle bodies off of a Mustang, a streetcar Mustang. So I look, these look really nice. So, I mean, they're very clean, still see the iridite on them. And so I grab them and I said, hey, we're taking these. These are going on your airplane, from this other guy's shop. And he's like, well, I don't know if I could, I don't know if you can. I'm like, just get them. We're just taking them. That's it. We're going to take them. So I start unbolting them and we get back in the car and Matt, the guy that owns the plane I'm working on, goes, we're in Reno. There's Summit. What, you think we could just get brand new ones from Summit tomorrow? Like, I don't know. So I call my buddy from Summit and sure enough, they have them in stock. He puts them on the shelf and we go pick them up, put those on the plane. That is probably what made the biggest difference in how that thing ran. Even with all that other shit crossed up, the two throttles being in sync so that the engine had the same manifold pressure, left side versus right, no matter what throttle angle he used, so that it was contributing the same left side versus right side, made the biggest difference in how that thing ran, felt, smelled, and on and on and on. We made many, many other changes in that week while I was up there, and I went back another time. And so one of the other things we did was, I asked how they had tuned these things on the engine dyno originally, and they were on the engine dyno in a dyno room with dyno headers that were, folding collector headers or whatever, so the exhaust would go out of the dyno room. But when they put them in the airplane, they have those little shorty 3-inch stubs, maybe they're 6-inch stubs, but like you see on a real P51.
Yeah, there's no real exhaust manifold on a P51. The individual 12 exhausts just literally stick out the cowling and, like you say, a few inches long. So obviously you can't tune with a conventional automotive style collector and then go to that stubby style exhaust manifold and expect the same results. I mean, that's a fundamental change in the mechanical configuration of the engine. But of course, there's some challenges with getting Lamda out of a system like that. So how did you cope with that?
So I would have said you can't do it with Lamda, except that I thought, what's the worst that could happen? I mean, Summit's right there. We went and got a Lambda sensor, a Lambda module, and wired it in and thought, let's just go fly it around and look and see what it looks like. Well, we didn't have to. Before we even took off, I had the thing. He had it outside of his hangar with it strapped to his Toyota 4Runner so it couldn't take off, and then strapped down to a bunch of weights on the ground in the back, because even as you add throttle and add propeller, the airflow across the propeller is enough to lift the tail off the ground, and then it puts the propeller close to the ground. So we were trying to do it that way and run it that way and, add fuel. And of course, it's two ECUs. So I got two laptops and I'm trying to make changes to the left one and the right one at the same time. Finally, I'm like, look, if we just get Lambda and go fly it around, if it works, it's going to be like tuning. This will be cake. You go fly it, and every single time you fly it, I'll make every part of it better, until it doesn't need anything. So we've got the guys that have been around for 30 years that have worked on these planes, and one of them's an engineer. And so he's like, yeah, don't even waste your time. There's no way it'll ever work. So I'm like, okay, so we're doing it anyway. So we go get one, and there's no one around. And then the excuse is there's no one around to weld a Lambda bung into the header of this thing. So I'm like, give me the Heliarc, I'll weld it in. So I, weld the thing, and it looks like shit, but it's in. And then we start the engine and we do the same thing. We like, oh, okay, it's idling. And of course, it's reading like whatever, Lambda 1.6 or something at an idle. It idles at about 1,000 from memory. And I'm like, I'm thumbs up, rev it up a little bit. So he revs it up to like 1,500 and it's still, total crap. And then I'm like, go a little more. And he gets to 2,000 and it just goes bink right to 86 Lambda. And it's dead stable. And I'm thinking, what, did it default there or what's it doing? So I'm like, go 2,500. So it goes 2,500. About 3,000 was the threshold of where it was trying to be really scary with it tied to the truck. So 2,500 seems good. So like, okay, cool. Just go back down to 2,000. Let me take 10% out and see what it does. So I just whacked 10 out of the overall trim, and the Lambda jumps up to like 93. And I'm thinking, oh, let me stick 10 in and see what it does. So then it goes 79. And I'm like, man, it looks like normal. So I said, okay, so we shut it down. Now the cool thing is the guy that was, it'll never work, was standing right there. So I'm like, what do you think of that? Because of course he was pointing out how fucked up it was at an idle, right? But I don't care about an idle. Idle's easy. I can adjust the idle mixture up and down, look at the engine speed, and that's it, right? So now we think we got something. So we send him up for a flight, bring him back down, pull the data, magic. It is literally just like looking at any car. You've got the Lambda trace, and in a plane, I didn't realize how steady state that stuff is. You move the throttle and then you leave it, and you got that governor. I mean, he would fly it for 45 minutes, and it would maintain 3,000 RPM within plus or minus about 10 RPM for 45 minutes. I've never seen anything run, not even an idle or anything that was that stable. It was crazy. But obviously it's super simple to tune because there's zero transient. So that made it easy.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. I had my own experience tuning an experimental aircraft back years and years and years ago. A guy, he brought in a kit from the States and built it up, and he was pretty sick. He was a very experienced pilot in his own right, but he was pretty sick to death of the general aviation options in terms of Lycomia and Continental, which haven't really seen any technological advances since, I don't know, the 40s or whatever. But they do have in their favour reliability, and that, as we've already talked about, kind of important when you're up in the sky. But he wanted to go a different route, so he ended up with, I think it was a Subaru EZ30, which is a 3-litre flat six, but it has variable cam timing. I think it was on the inlet cam only, and it kind of has a VTEC style mechanism with a variable lift. And I was sort of thinking to myself, this is actually on a M800 as well, and I was thinking to myself, oh, this is going to be an interesting one to tune because you don't obviously have feedback from a dyno. And we did the same thing you were just mentioning there. We strapped the thing to a fence post, actually. It's a pretty substantial fence post, and granted wasn't making anything like the sort of power your Reno Air Race engine was making. But the tuning of that was actually incredibly easy because, I wasn't getting a torque number, and I thought particularly tuning the variable valve timing was going to be tricky. But the reality is with the variable pitch propeller, which I could control independently, if you made a change, be fuel ignition or cam timing, and you made more torque, well, of course, the RPM increased. So then you'd just add a bit more pitch to the propeller to pull it back down to the same cell, and you'd go again. So while we never got a number, it actually was incredibly easy to tune. And the other thing is, unlike a car, you have a relatively narrow band through the map that you operate in, because generally as you add throttle, your inlet manifold pressure and RPM kind of go up together. So you sort of kind of end up with this little tiny envelope or slice through the fuel and ignition tables that you're actually using. So pretty easy, really. I had another experience which was one more level above that. A guy had a replica Spitfire, and that was powered by an LS2 6-litre V8. And we actually tuned that with, I think helicopter pilots use it when they're lifting loads, and it's basically a digital strain gauge or load sensor that you put between the hook on the helicopter and your load, and then it's got a remote readout.
A fish scale.
Yeah, pretty much, exactly. And so we had that between the tail wheel and this, again, fence post, Hilux, whatever it might have been. And I'm sitting in the back of this plane, the pilot's up the front, working the throttle, and, you're physically seeing, add 2 degrees of timing, I made, another bunch of torque, and it was actually quite effective. Of course, challenges there that maybe what you do on the ground doesn't work at sort of 10 or 15,000 feet. What was the sort of end story with that Reno Air Race aircraft, though? Is there anything else you learned, any other challenges along the way?
So the next thing was once the Lambda worked and I could make adjustments, then it's like, okay, but now we're making the whole engine's adjustments from one of 12 cylinders. So how good is that, right? So we need more. So he said, look, how many? The thing is, I think I took over because there's limited wiring in the plane. It's very difficult to change it. So I believe I took over the throttle position signal from the TPS because we really didn't need it. It never changes the throttle fast enough to even need accel enrichment. So I think we took over the other one for the other half of the engine. So we had Lambda, and then we ran Lambda on the opposite side of the engine. And then however many cylinders we could get it to reach forward and back, and sort of check them all. But in reality, they were all very close to each other. And then in the end, I told him, hey, in my mind, if the Lambda works this good, we should run the thing in closed loop. And then you can have a trim knob, which he already had. And then the trim knob can move the Lambda aim, and then once it's in closed loop, it'll move the Lambda aim up and down, and that's going to be way better than you trying to adjust it to a specific EGT. So this was funny. After all of this, he's like, I'm not really sure I want to run that Lambda control. I'm not really sure how redundant, what happens if the sensor goes bad? I'm like, well, first, I won't let it trim very much. So it's only going to have a few percent of trim. But give me a break. You've been running this thing with the map sensors crossed, the TPS is crossed. Shit's been backwards and forwards, the wrong map in this side and that side. And now you're worried about me running Lambda control with like a 5% trim.
Yeah.
But in the end, he loved it. It ran great. He'd go run it. I'd make another adjustment pretty soon. Obviously, it's trimming 0 everywhere. Finally, he can see the changes he wants to see and the adjustments he's making. The plane's smooth. It's fast. I think I'm actually not allowed to say how fast it really was going because he could get in trouble based on how close he was to the ground when we were testing it. But I qualified. Unfortunately, in that race, the class that he's in, the planes are grouped together, and I can't quite remember how, but whatever the result is, that you've got the fastest guy and the slowest guy, and that's pretty much how they qualify. And then when they start the race, unless something happens to the guys in front, you finish that way also. So his plane it was faster than it had been previously. More importantly, it ran far better, and everything was correct on it.
And the rod stayed inside the block.
The rod stayed in. That was an important piece. That was part of the puzzle. Didn't break itself, and he I think he qualified either 5th or 7th and ended 5th or 7th, but he was stoked. And I just talked to him a little while ago, and he still flies it all the time. He's like, it still runs great. So one interesting thing about that was that it would in a little bit of a nose down angle, it would make boost. I mean, it would have inlet manifold pressure over ambient, with the front of the plane pointed down a little bit, so it gets some little extra airspeed. It had ram air. Oh, that's one other thing.
So the ram effect is real.
Yes, the ram effect was real. I remember, I think the local elevation there was like, 6,000 or something like that, or maybe it was 5,500. And I think it was about 80 or 82 kPa baro pressure. And he might have up to 102 or 103 manifold pressure.
Oh, so it's actually significant.
Yeah, it was pretty significant. I mean, the plane goes at least 300 miles an hour.
Yeah, sure.
It goes more than that. But anyway, and what was the other thing? Oh, the other thing was the way the air came in to feed the two throttle bodies. It's a single duct at the front, and then it's a Y, and it goes around behind the engine, comes up and feeds air to the two throttle bodies. And so they put the air temp sensors into the Y at the back near the throttle body, and they put them both in from the same direction on the tube. So how would I say that? If I was looking at from the rear towards the front of the engine, I would see the two throttle bodies pointing at me, and the air pipes would feed into them. And the sensors were both on the 3 o'clock part of the air inlet, right? Instead of one at 3 o'clock and the one on the opposite side at 9 o'clock. Because of the way the direction the pipes went, that would technically be more right for left to right. Anyway, the point is, they're both at 3 o'clock, and one would always read hotter air temp than the other. And we couldn't figure out why. So at some point, I said, why don't you move the air temp on that one to be on the outside, on the outside of the turn, kind of, so it's mirror image. Because right now it's not mirror image. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. And so as soon as we did, the air temps then came within a couple of degrees of each other. So it had something to do with the swirl or whatever was going on in those pipes. The shape of those pipes changed what the temperature reading was of the air temp sensor.
That's interesting. I mean, something you'd never, ever get to conventionally see, because you obviously don't have two air temp sensors right beside each other.
Yep.
All right. We are getting a little bit long here, but there's one more topic that I wanted to cover if we've got time here, Shane. And this is something that's come out of a conversation with a mutual friend of ours, actually, just in the last couple of weeks, which was a conversation about techniques for launch control strategies. And I know with the amount of time and success you've had in drag racing, you're going to be all over this. So if I go back to my days drag racing with my old Evo, and the technique that I was using at the time, which I guess probably a bunch of people still are, was just using an ignition cut as a secondary rev limiter. So basically when clutch switch was activated, it would bring in a secondary rev limiter, and then we were using a bunch of ignition retard and then controlling the engine RPM ultimately with ignition cut. So that was great for spooling the turbo, because every time we've got an ignition cut event, we're sending a full cylinder load of unburned fuel in the air out into the exhaust. Combine that with the ignition retard, and we're burning that, combusting that in the exhaust, providing energy to spool the turbo. But first of all, ignition cut is not very nice on the valve train, particularly with some engines are susceptible to some problems with the valve train. And, cuts in general, particularly once we start making more and more power, generally they do nasty things to the engine. The other problem with this is it didn't really matter to me because I was using a conventional clutch, but even with good control, you'd still see the RPM sort of fluctuate. It'd be oscillating around our set point. Say we wanted to launch at 7,000 RPM, and it might be plus or minus 1 to 200. So quite a variation. For those cars that are running a proper drag racing style slider clutch with centrifugal weights, you want to make sure that launch RPM is absolutely exactly the same RPM every launch, so that there's no variability and you're going to get the same results out of the clutch. And we couldn't get that with this launch control strategy. And if you hear sort of current crop of sport compact drag cars with big turbos, small engines, they all sort of sound the same. There's none of this sort of popping and banging. It all seems to be done using just ignition retard. Can you talk us through that strategy? Is it solely ignition retard that you're using, and why is that?
Yes. For 90% of the control, it's ignition timing. And then you would typically set a maximum and then start cutting after that if you had to. So in other words, if I screw up and I can't control it enough with timing retard because I haven't given it enough window to be able to control in, at least it will stop when it hits the engine cut level. I stopped. You can get away with cut if you have enough disconnect between the engine and the tire, be either via a clutch that's loose, slipping, or a converter that's loose and not trying to couple. The cut will work. All those things you said about how it makes the engine act are true. As long as you have enough of a sponge between the crankshaft and the tire, the variation in the engine speed and the power output kind of works itself out in the slipping part, and it ends up with smooth application to the tire. The trouble in a drag car with a slick is that cut is, if it's not well, say, filtered out by the clutch or the converter, you're on a V8, you're varying the power by at least 12.5% every time you cut a cylinder. And it's it's not a very granular change. What you're using is a super coarse screw to try and make your adjustment. And so we found that it was a lot easier to use ignition timing retard and use a huge amount of variation between even cylinder firings to be able to control the engine speed is a lot smoother. And then the added benefit of using the timing retard with a turbo is that it heats the exhaust side of the turbo system up a lot, and that makes the turbo more efficient as you go down the other end of the racetrack. The one problem that you have is when you're using a lot of timing retard, you're generating a lot of heat, which is really good for the turbo, really good for the turbine, not so good for the exhaust side of the engine. Exhaust valves tend to want to overheat. You're leaving a lot of temperature in the combustion chamber on the exhaust side. And so too much also doesn't work. I have proven, unfortunately, a few times on some Pro Mod engines that trying to be all in with the turbo and use only timing retard results in damage when you swing the timing back in and you're ready for all the power you can produce at the other end of the track. The engine then is at an operating point where it can't accept the timing and it'll break. And there's about no way you can get around it.
Okay. So this brings up a bunch more questions that I want to cover. So firstly, in terms of my own strategy, I would use quite aggressive ignition retard initially. So depending on the size of the turbo versus the engine, I might be sort of pulling 20 degrees of timing initially to start spooling that turbocharger. But then I would also have a three-dimensional map of timing retard versus boost pressure. So as I came up towards my target boost pressure, we might put the timing back in and be sort of maybe between sort of -5 and TDC or something of that nature. Obviously, turbo and boost dependent. With this application only using ignition retard, I can only imagine that the ultimate retard you're going to need must be massive, sort of in the 35 to 45 degree range. Is that sort of, am I picking this up, what you're putting down?
Yeah, so the thing is, we're talking about a couple different things, and I'm maybe describing what I've recently been working on, which is non-clutch car and a clutch car. So in the case of a clutch, we used to try to control the boost with the ignition timing. We would put the engine on a rev limiter at wherever we wanted to launch, retard the timing 30 after TDC until it came up to the boost that you wanted, and then start putting timing back in and literally use the ignition timing to control the boost to a flat number. You'd have the wastegate closed. But we found that, particularly with a weather change, there will be enough variation in that method that you don't get a consistent enough result every time. So that's when we started using the blow-off valve. So then what we would do is we would just leave the timing at 20 after and open the blow-off valve and effectively use the blow-off valve as a boost control to control the boost on the starting line so that it always comes up to the same boost number.
That technique as well, just separate topic, but even if you're just using the ignition retard like you just mentioned and like I was, you'll still see that the boost is going to oscillate. You're not going to get a nice perfect flat line at say 20 psi or whatever you want to leave the line at. It's always going to be oscillating. It might be plus or minus a couple of psi, which kind of gives that same effect as the RPM moving around. And now you've got two variables. You've got the RPM moving and you've got your boost. So your engine power and RPM are both different every time you drop the clutch.
Doesn't matter if you're off in left field or if you're making hero runs, but when you're trying to be consistent and make consistent runs, it's all about taking variables away, and that's one of them. You have the RPM swing, you kind of get rid of that, and then you have the boost swing, and you at the very least, even if that's not really what caused you to not make it down the racetrack on that particular run, you can see that it's not the same, and so you're spending time working on something that maybe is or isn't related to the problem. So if you can smooth it out, then it can't be the problem, and you can move on. And so that's how we started doing that. With a torque converter, it's a little more difficult because you have to still get the engine to drive through the torque converter. Same problem we had with that little engine on the water brake, where the load on the dyno wasn't able to be reduced enough to make the engine accelerate up to 8,000. Well, you have the same problem with the engine. If there's no boost on it, or the engine's not making peak power, it can't accelerate quickly through the torque converter to get to launch RPM. So there's a balance there.
In that instance, the ignition retard is the worst thing you can do because you need torque to bring it up on the converter and get to your launch RPM. And as you retard the timing, you're making less torque. So that's a common misconception, I think, for people who have gone from a manual style transmission with a clutch to an auto, and they try and apply the same launch control strategy. And of course, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, you're choosing sort of with the ignition advance, you're choosing whether you want to use the energy in the cylinder to turn the crankshaft, or you want to take it from there and use it to turn the turbine. And so you don't get to have both. So like you said, if you just take all the timing out of it and put it up against the converter, the engine doesn't rev high enough it doesn't move enough mass flow to do anything to the turbine. And so you make no boost. So what you have to do is drive it through the converter until it gets high enough that when you yank all the timing out of it and add heat to the mass flow you have, you can then finally spool the turbo up where you want it to be. And once you've got it where you want, you can either leave the timing out and do the boost control thing with a blow-off valve like I'm doing, or put the timing back in, whatever it is. It starts to be a bit more normal then compared to a clutch. Clutch makes it a lot easier because, you don't have anything trying to stop the crankshaft. So it doesn't take a lot of power to get an engine to run wide open at 7,000. You can take all the power out of the cylinder and put it in the turbine to help get the turbo spooled up. It's a lot harder with a converter.
Okay. I'm interested just in terms of comparing using an ignition cut with aggressive retard versus just retard, which will probably be more aggressive again. My gut feel is that the ignition retard plus ignition cut, so you're sending that unburned fuel and air from a cylinder out into the exhaust manifold where it's going to produce energy to spool the turbo. That technique would be more effective in spooling a big turbo on a small engine. Am I right, wrong, or is there no difference?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've done it a lot of different ways, and I'm not sure so first thing is that there's not any right answer because it's application dependent.
I mean, clearly you're not having problems spooling these turbochargers, so it's working.
Yeah, so look, in the end, when you can't get the turbo to spool, you have only a couple of options. You need more mass flow, rev the engine up higher, more timing retard, but that'll only work if the engine will still achieve the RPM you want. And that's pretty much all you have to work with. You either need mass flow or you need heat in the exhaust, and the rev limiters just sort of keep the engine in the right place while you're doing that. Again, it might be application specific. Every drag race car that I work on does ultimately have a rev limiter on it, but there's been times where the engine's weak or something like that. It doesn't achieve the actual rev limit with cut. It's got enough ignition retard trying to make boost, and it goes to the same boost level because the blow-off valve holds it the same. That it just sits there. It's like sounds smooth. There's no cut at all because it can't quite get high enough to cut, and it goes ahead and works anyway.
In terms of the exhaust gas temperature rise, just solely relying on retard as opposed to cut, I mean, clearly you're going to need more retard than how I was running mine. And just to reiterate, I'd pull a lot of timing initially, and then once we got up to the boost pressure, we might be between sort of 0 and 5 degrees after TDC, there or thereabouts. Whereas I'm guessing, again, depending on a bunch of parameters, you might be minus 30, minus 35 degrees. How much of a challenge? Oh, first of all, looking at your face there, maybe I'm out of the ballpark with that minus 35, but basically I'm guessing regardless of what the retard is, it's going to be more than I was running, hence you're going to get a climb in EGT. Is this something that really needs careful management by the driver? If someone sort of hangs them out to dry on the tree, are you likely to burn down an engine using just retard?
I don't know that you can burn the engine down, but obviously things, particularly with a torque converter, you're sitting there forever. It is just the heat is going up almost, vertically by the second. So yeah, it is generally a problem if someone hangs you out on the tree. However, that's kind of the pill you have to swallow when you decide you're going to run a turbocharged combination. And so it's really up to you to figure out how to make sure that can't affect your performance, because certainly it's legal for somebody to try and do it, and it might be frowned upon. But in reality, if someone wants to win bad enough and they're going to do that, that's on you. That's not on them.
Well, I think particularly as well with the smarter drag racers, they will assess where an opponent has a weakness, and if they can exploit it, well, Again, if it's legal, why wouldn't you? So has this sort of come down a little bit to driver education as well, and to how to deal with the launch strategy so you don't end up damaging components?
So we sort of have a, again, it's going to be application specific, and I'm talking specifically about a pro mod. So we have a torque converter based automatic pro mod. And so typically what happens is either, we have some sort of problem where the tree doesn't come down. Either that's because the tree doesn't come down or because we don't stage the car. Because, of course, the way it works with an automatic is that you spool the turbo before you ever stage, because you don't ever want to be staged and not have full boost. So you have full boost, and then you creep in by pulse width modulating the trans brake solenoid or whatever type of drive unit you have to be able to allow the car to stage while it's at full boost. And then, of course, the other guy has to stage, and the tree has to come down. Or if he's staged already, at least the tree comes down, whatever. In the case that doesn't happen, we just have a rule with the driver, which is you just go. At the very least, we want to see what the car does compared to the racetrack, and we don't give a shit about the wind light or the time. So if you're sitting there for so long that you think it's something, you just go, or the tree malfunctions, just go. Because if you stop and start again, you put so much heat into the system, we're not going to learn anything anyway. We're likely to break something. So it's either give up and go back or just go make a run. Typically what will happen is the car won't creep into the beam all the way. And, you either get a red light because you're not in time, or, it's just not going to creep or move in and stage at all. So you're not going to get a time. So then it's just like, once you realize it's not going to go, you just let the trans brake off and make a run anyway. And we'll at least look at the data and evaluate if the change we made was good or not, even if we don't have a time slip.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. Just good to get some insight into how you're using these launch control strategies, because with turbocharged engines, it can really make or break the whole run.
So this is what I would call the anti-lag strategy, because the launch control is after what happens in my mind after you leave the starting line. But yeah, so that's the thing. The other thing too, we keep switching back and forth. And so once the car leaves the starting line, that's where I am controlling both the engine speed and the drive shaft speed or the wheel speed with ignition timing retard only. No cut. You can use cut. Again, it works okay if you have a spongy enough device between the crankshaft and the rear wheel, the converter or the clutch.
Even aside from the effect of a cut on upsetting the traction of the tire, once we start getting up into the sort of 2, 3, 4,000 horsepower vicinity, though, generally tuners and engine builders try wherever possible to stay away from cuts, because they can do some nasty things to the engine, correct?
Yeah. I again, use a cut as like a last resort and use timing retard to manage. And then the cut might be there just like, again, in case you can't quite get it or something bad happens, just to try and save it. But yeah, just typically you're not using cut. However, there have been people that have used cut only to a great effect, and they get away with it. So
yeah. There's no black and white here, but there's some general guidelines and some general sort of rules that we like to try and follow. Now, the other thing that goes sort of beyond this is, a lot of drag racing, particularly when you've got a car that's making more power than it can put to the track at just about any point in the track, it all becomes about power management. And I'm guessing I'm right in saying here, you're not trying to feed all of the power that the engine can produce and then trying to fix the inherent wheel spin that's going to occur by ignition retard, because you're going to be going down the track with 5 degrees, 10 degrees after TDC. So really it's a case of trying to match the power delivery, the torque to the tire to what the track can take, and then you're relying on that ignition retard sort of passive traction control, I guess I'll call it, as a backstop if you get it just a little bit wrong and you do get a bit of breakaway wheel spin, correct?
Yeah, it's like, so that's one of the problems with the Bonneville car, because it'll spin the tires till 4 miles. It makes enough power and the grip is so low that you can spin all the way to 4 miles. So if you're running the boost level that you can achieve in 4 miles at 1 mile, you maybe require 1,200 horsepower to turn the tire, and you're using 3,000, and subtracting 1,800 to get to the 1,200 you can use at the tire, and you're subtracting it by retarding the timing. And all you're doing is heating the exhaust side of the engine and the exhaust inside the car up. That is absolutely a problem with with Speed Demon. We struggle with trying to manage the boost level that we actually require versus the traction control, which is doing timing retard. And in that case, it can do some cut too. Same thing. It does retard first, and if it can't control it enough, it starts cutting. In a drag race application, yeah, it depends. It's a little bit application specific, but in the case of this Pro Mod that runs the 8th mile, I've found that it's easiest to try and just let it make the same boost every single run. Get the boost in as fast as you can, and use timing retard solely to manage the wheel speed. So if you can imagine in a closed loop boost control system where you're drawing boost over maybe speed or engine speed or time or whatever, imagine drawing the wheel slip curve just like in a traction control setup over time, and then the ECU uses timing retard to try and hold that traction control curve that you've pre-programmed. So it's effectively closed loop power management. I mean, it's looking at the wheel speed input and it's adjusting the timing in or out like crazy. Now, having said that, you have a shaped curve because, as you said, you can't use all the power you can generate at the beginning of the run. Maybe after 2 seconds, you can use all of it. So you have a allowed maximum. This is just how I do it. An allowed maximum under all conditions, no matter you're never allowed to run more ignition timing than this, which will be sort of like a conservative curve, let's say, and it can take away from that. So, and then you have a minimum also. So I think I just said that in reverse. So the conservative curve is the lowest timing card it can ever use. And then you have a all-in best case scenario. Here's the max you can ever use. But that would not be the max ignition timing that makes the most horsepower. That's the max you could use at the other end of the racetrack, right? Or it's the max you could use at that point on the racetrack effectively. Like, again, we know we can't use 4,000 in a spot on the racetrack where you can only use 1,200 to turn the tire. So you sort of have a timing shape and then a lower timing shape. And the ECU is looking at the wheel speed and it's adjusting the timing. Could be 12 or 15 degrees between the min and the max, between those two guardrails, and giving you some sort of average until it finally gets to the point where it's trying to put all of it in and spin the tire and it can't get there, right? Because it runs out of power and then it's all in, down the back half of the racetrack. So, and I mean, look, the Bonneville car's kind of the same. I treat it just like a long drag race.
Very, very long drag race.
60-second drag race on salt.
All right, Shane, I think we've taken up enough of your time. I think we've well exceeded 2 hours now, and I do want to respect your time, but I think it was worth getting in that last topic there on launch strategies and ignition control. Now, I know we've already done one of these interviews with you before. We've obviously got the same 3 questions we ask at the end to all of our guests. I'm going to ask them again, and I don't know, maybe we'll see some different answers. So the first of those questions is, what's next in the future for you?
Well, I'm still supporting the land speed guys. Pikes Peak just happened. I'm going tomorrow to the Midwest Drag Racing Series with this twin turbo pro mod that I've been working on for years. So those are sort of the normal things, but I've got some actually really cool guys that are doing some pretty cool streetcar stuff, like SEMA-ish. I mean, these guys they are spending money and buying things like they are racing. It is for a street-driven car, but it's cool stuff. So it's exciting because I get to use a lot of technology, and maybe it's not for a race car, but in my mind, it's a race car. They happen to be driving on the street. So I've got that coming up. They've got a bunch of projects for me to work on. So I'm excited to kind of start working with those guys a little bit. We've sold them a bunch of parts, but it's time to start making things work now.
I'm just interested on a side note there, given, obviously you're active in just about every form of motorsport, street cars, as you just mentioned, Reno air race applications as well. I'm going to assume you've probably done something in a jet boat or something of that nature. Do you have a favorite? Like, what's the most satisfying for Shane?
I suppose I have a predisposition towards drag racing because that was my, background when I was a kid, and I suppose that's probably the thing I'm most passionate about. But I mean, in reality, they're all fun and they all have their own unique challenges, and that's. What's so cool about doing this job is the fact that we have access to all of the sensors to monitor things and data acquisition to be able to take a look at the data and see a problem and come up with a solution, and then be able to implement that solution and then see the result in the data. Even if it's not something obvious, like even if the time slip doesn't show the result, you can see in the data if you're going the right way or not, or if it solved the problem. And so it's every one of these is that way. If there was no data logging, I don't think it would be nearly as much fun. The fun is trying to learn. And then, obviously, like you, I'm sort of a little bit of a technical guy, and I want to know, hey, does this theory I've been promoting, does it actually work? Like when I go to Pikes Peak, does map over EMAP really take care of the problem? And so you're always sort of trying to prove that. And the engine management side of it lends itself to that because it inherently has lots of sensors and it has data logging, and being able to see it in multiple different kinds of applications. Then you could take a theory and say, well, I'm not just using one data point to reference this theory from, I'm using multiple data points. And that's the other thing that's been cool, is being able to work on all these different kinds of applications and take things that are almost a given in one genre of motorsport and see where you could apply them in another motorsport to great effect. It's been a lot of fun. It's always fun. So yeah.
I think each of those applications has its own sort of challenges and appeal. So I think what you said there is quite a good point, though, taking something that's understood and known in one genre of motorsport, and you go drag racing, for example, and no one's ever thought of that. Even though it's pretty obvious to those in, say, road race or whatever it might be. I don't know of an example, but and then apply it. I think for me, I kind of tend to agree on the drag racing. Not that I'm been active in drag racing now for 10 plus years. It's not that helpful when the closest competitive drag strip's on the other end of the country. But what I liked about drag racing, for me, I kind of always felt it was the ultimate test of an engine builder and an engine tuner. And we all know that people can get bullshit dyno numbers, but if you know what you're looking at, the mile an hour pretty much tells you everything you need to know about what the car's actually doing. The other thing I really liked about drag racing is that a quarter mile is a quarter mile, no matter whether it's in the US, New Zealand, Australia, or Puerto Rico. So instantly you're competing on a level playing field, and people can understand a 6.1 or a 580 or whatever. It's the same wherever you are. Whereas if I quote a lap time from Highlands Motorsport Park, I mean, unless you've been around there, it's absolutely meaningless. All right, next question, Shane. Is there any advice you'd give to one of our listeners, the younger version of yourself, maybe to help reach where you are today in your career faster?
Put your phone down. Get to work.
That's actually pretty solid advice. It seems to be in a downward spiral. I like it, though.
It's not mine. I took it from my friend, Scott Palmer. I think it's brilliant. Everybody asks me, and I say the same thing now from now on. Put your phone down, get to work. Don't be afraid to put in the effort or the time. You're not going straight to the top. It takes a while to get there. Be humble. Put your phone down.
Nobody cares. Work harder. I like that one too. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty hard to tune a car or build an engine if you're scrolling Instagram all day. So yeah, granted. And I mean, it is becoming a real issue in our generation, unfortunately, or probably actually my kids' generation is the bigger issue. I don't personally think anything good's coming of it, but we're probably getting a little far off topic. We'll get off our soapbox for now.
Right.
All right, last question, Shane. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how they're best to do so, what are your social media accounts?
Yeah, sort of all the same ways. Instagram, YouTube, Tuned by Shane T. There is a Tuned by Shane T Facebook page. There's a Shane Tecklenburg Facebook page, and there is a website, tunedbyshanet.com, which basically dumps you back into motorsportcontrol.com, which is my website. So all of those ways, plus, of course, the traditional ways, which no one wants to use, telephone and email.
Scary, yeah. As usual, we'll put links to those accounts in the show notes to make it easy for people to find you. Look, Shane, always a pleasure to get a chance to chat to you, and great to get a catch up on what's happened since 3 years ago or whatever it was when we started this whole journey. So thank you again for coming on the show, and hopefully with any luck we might be able to bump into you stateside sometime. I think we're heading over to SEMA this year, so if you're hanging around, we'll see if we can catch up.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Incidentally, I managed to catch up with somebody wearing an HP Academy shirt at Pikes Peak. I took a selfie with them behind me.
Mike McGuinness, I think, would probably have been your guy. He was...
It might have been Mike. I was standing behind him, and we were waiting for all the cars to come back down. It probably was Mike, actually. Yeah, so he's facing the other way, and I've got his back, and I'm pointing at the shirt.
He's one of our tutors who kind of works remote, but we actually just had him over. We filmed an auto transmission, or auto and DCT transmission tuning course, and he's ex-Cobb and does a lot of their emissions compliance work with SEMA. So he's actually currently working on an emissions compliance tuning course, because obviously that's becoming a hot topic. So he was there supporting Cole Powelson in the Sierra.
Yeah, so they actually they got fourth. They finished ahead of us, yeah.
Yeah, did amazing, yeah. All right, we'll let you get out of here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I appreciate you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Shane T, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high-quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to FranBen34 from the US, who has said, great for motorsport and automotive knowledge and learning the backgrounds from the guests. Courses are excellent to go into more depth on the topics. Oh, thanks for your kind words. If you want to get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.